3 Marines, 1 woman, 0 hesitation. She walked into a restricted military compound wearing no rank, no unit patch, nothing that explained why the guards let her pass. When Sergeant Cole Maddox, 6'2", 230 pounds of decorated muscle and institutional rage, reached for her wrist in front of the entire training yard, she gave him exactly 1 warning. He didn't take it. What happened next stopped every boot on that base cold. But the physical confrontation wasn't the real story. The real story was who she was and what she'd already been watching before anyone knew to be afraid. If you've never subscribed to this channel, this is the story that will make you. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, stay with me. Every second of this matters. The first thing Elena Voss noticed when she stepped through the eastern gate of Blackridge Military Training Facility was that the guard post smelled like old coffee and resentment. Not an unusual combination for a base, but the particular quality of it, stale, heavy, almost combative, told her something specific. These men weren't bored. Bored soldiers got lazy, sloppy, easy to read. These soldiers were careful, carefully blank, carefully agreeable. Like men who had learned that having opinions came with consequences. That told her more than the initial report had. She handed her credentials to the younger of the 2 guards, late 20s, Lance Corporal chevrons, a small scar above his left eyebrow that hadn't fully faded. He looked at the ID card, looked at her, looked at the card again. His partner, older and thicker, through the shoulders, had already clocked her plain utility uniform with the expression of someone doing math in his head and not liking the numbers. No name tape on the chest, no rank insignia on the collar, no unit patch on the sleeve, standard issue boots, scuffed at the toe but clean at the heel, a single canvas bag over one shoulder. She watched the Lance Corporal's eyes go to the authorization code on the card. She watched him process it. She watched the moment his face went carefully, professionally neutral. "Ma'am," he handed the card back. "You're cleared through. Do you need an escort to?" "No." She took the card, pocketed it, and walked through the gate. Behind her, she heard the older guard exhale through his teeth. Low enough to be deniable. She kept walking. Blackridge was not a large facility by active duty standards. It ran recruit and advanced individual training cycles on a rotating schedule, which meant the population shifted every few months, new faces cycling in, graduates cycling out, a permanent cadre of drill instructors and senior NCOs holding the institutional culture together like rebar in concrete. The problem with rebar was that it held its shape even when the concrete around it started to crack. Elena had read the file 3 times on the flight in. Not because she'd forgotten the content she hadn't, but because files had a way of flattening things. Numbers on a page didn't sweat. Complaint reports didn't shake when they were written. She'd learned years ago that reading documentation was only half of understanding a place. The other half was standing inside it, breathing the air, watching how people moved when nobody thought nobody important was looking. She was very good at being nobody important. She crossed the main parade ground at an unhurried pace, eyes forward, posture neutral. Not military stiff, not civilian casual. A comfortable middle ground that read as either a contractor or a low-level administrative transfer, depending on who was looking. She dressed deliberately for ambiguity. Utility uniform was legitimate Marine Corps issued, correct pattern, no violations, but stripped of everything that would tell someone at a glance where she fit in the hierarchy. The effect was immediate and predictable. People looked at her and then looked away, which meant they'd filed her in a mental category that didn't require further attention. She was nobody's problem. She was background noise. She let herself be background noise, and she watched. The morning training cycle was already underway on the eastern field. 2 fire teams running movement drills under the supervision of a staff sergeant who was doing the job correctly clear commands, consistent feedback, no yelling for the sake of yelling. She noted it. Good NCOs were worth noting just as carefully as bad ones. Then she heard the voice from the adjacent bay. Not words, at first just a particular quality of sound. The kind of volume a man uses when he wants the sound itself to be a weapon. She adjusted her route without breaking stride and came around the edge of the equipment shed in time to see Sergeant Cole Maddox standing over Private First Class Dana Ruiz. Ruiz was young, couldn't have been more than 20, maybe younger. She was kneeling on the tarmac beside a disassembled field radio that was laid out on a maintenance cloth in front of her, components sorted in precise rows. Her hands were still. Her face was still. But her jaw was clenched in a way that someone standing close enough could see the kind of clenching that happened when you were working very hard to keep everything that wanted to come out of your face locked somewhere behind your back teeth. Maddox was circling her, not pacing circling. There was a difference, and Elena had seen enough of both to know it. Pacing was nerves. Circling was deliberate. Circling was theater. You think this is a joke? His voice had that particular quality of a man who'd discovered a long time ago, that volume could substitute for argument. You think maintenance intervals are suggestions? You think, Sergeant, I completed the... Did I ask you a question? Did I ask you a question, Ruiz? She didn't answer. Smart girl. I asked you if I asked you a question. The logical trap was petty and practiced. Elena had seen it before. Men who used it weren't looking for answers. They were looking for the moment when the other person got frustrated enough to stumble, and then they used the stumble to justify everything that came after. Maddox stepped to the side, and his boot came down on the edge of the maintenance cloth. Not an accident. The corner dragged, shifting two of the sorted components out of alignment. Small, deniable. Looks like you need to start over. Ruiz looked at the displaced parts. She didn't look up at him. She just reached out with one hand and began repositioning them. From the beginning, private. Yes, Sergeant. Elena watched Ruiz begin disassembling what she'd already assembled, moving with the flat mechanical compliance of someone who had made a decision about where she kept her actual self, somewhere Maddox couldn't reach it. That kind of self-preservation instinct was learned, and it was learned fast. It meant this wasn't new. She took her notepad from her bag and began writing without looking down at the page. She was still writing when Maddox turned and saw her. He didn't say anything right away. That was interesting. Most men in his position would have said something presence of immediately challenged the presence of an unfamiliar face, established authority through volume, made the first move. Maddox looked at her for 3 full seconds before he spoke, which meant he was calculating. He was reading her uniform the same way the gate guard had, arriving at the same absence of obvious rank, but arriving at a different conclusion. The gate guard had been uncertain. Maddox was contemptuous. This is a restricted training area. He walked toward her with the loose-shouldered gait of a man who expected open water in his path. Civilians need to be in the admin building. I'm not a civilian. No insignia, no unit. I have authorization. Authorization from who? Elena looked at him steadily. The kind that got me through your gate this morning. She watched that land. She watched him, decide it was an unsatisfying answer, and that the appropriate response to an unsatisfying answer was to keep pressing. He was a man who'd learned that pressure resolved most things, and that the things it didn't resolve could be reframed as the other person's failure. Name, he said. Voss rank. She held his gaze. I'm not required to provide that to you. In this context, Sergeant. The word sergeant landed with precision. It told him she knew exactly where he sat in the hierarchy without acknowledging where she sat in relation to it. She watched that register behind his eyes. You're on a restricted installation, he said, and you're observing an active training exercise without command-authorized oversight. That's a security issue. Get command on the radio. She turned back to her notepad. He stared at her back for 2 seconds. She could feel it. Then she heard his boots on the tarmac, moving toward the radio station at the edge of the bay. And she kept writing. The response came back in under 4 minutes. She heard it clearly from where she was standing, clear enough that the 3 Marines who drifted close enough to observe the interaction heard it too. All Blackridge personnel, this is operations. Regarding the individual currently on the Eastern Training Ground, hold position. Do not escort. Do not detain. Continue normal operations. The radio operator repeated it back without inflection. Professional. Practiced. The silence that followed had weight. Maddox was holding the handset. He set it down with more care than necessary, the kind of care that was actually about controlling what his hand wanted to do. Elena wrote down the time in her notepad, 843. She heard his boots on the pavement again. Coming back toward her, she finished her sentence before she looked up. Satisfied, she asked. What are you here for? Routine review. Of what? Of whatever needs reviewing. She could see, in the careful stillness of his face, the specific shape of his frustration. He was a man accustomed to having categories for people. Categories told you how to handle situations, how much pushback was allowable, where the lines were. A woman with no rank and a mysterious radio authorization, who stood still and wrote things in a notepad while he circled her, was a category problem, and Maddox was not comfortable with category problems. Stay out of active training areas, he said. I'll be wherever my authorization permits, she said. Which, based on what just came over your radio, is most places on this installation. She held his eyes for 1 beat longer than was comfortable, then looked back down at her notepad. Behind her, she heard Ruiz quietly begin reassembling the radio. She spent the first 3 hours doing what she was trained to do, moving through the facility on no particular visible schedule, stopping in places long enough to observe without long enough to establish a pattern. The motor pool, the chow hall during the late morning break, the administrative corridor outside the training records office, the base gym, which told you things about a unit's culture that formal observation never could. What she found, piece by piece, it built into a picture she'd been assembling since she'd read the initial report. Blackridge was, on paper, a functioning installation. Training cycles completed on time. Qualification scores within acceptable parameters. Incident reports at statistically normal levels, maybe slightly below normal, which was, depending on the installation, either a sign of effective leadership or a sign of something else entirely. She was increasingly certain it was the latter. The thing about abuse of authority was that it rarely looked like what people imagined. People imagined dramatic confrontations, visible violence, something they could point at. What she'd seen in the initial complaint file and what she was now seeing in person was subtler and, in some ways, worse. It was a fine-tuned system of pressure and consequence that had been running long enough that the people inside it had stopped being able to clearly see it. They just thought it was how things worked. She sat at a corner table in the chow hall with a coffee she didn't need and listened to 3 lance corporals, 2 tables over talk around a subject, without naming it. The verbal gymnastics of people who had something to say, but had learned not to say it directly in any space that might have ears. Just saying, Trevino, put in for reassignment again. 3rd time. Yeah, a pause. You think it'll go through this time? Nah. Another pause. Someone set down a fork. Remember when Corvino did the same thing? Nobody answered that one. She wrote down the name Corvino in her notepad. At 1140, she was in the corridor outside the training records office, when the door opened and a staff sergeant she hadn't seen before came out holding a folder and nearly walked directly into her. He stepped back, assessed her with the practice speed of a career NCO, and landed on the spots on the same calculation the gate guard had, couldn't place her, moved to professional neutral. Sorry, ma'am. Didn't see you. No problem. She glanced at the folder. Just a glance, quick, natural, the kind of look anyone might give a passing document, rather than the kind that read as surveillance. The header tab was visible for half a second. Complaint resolution administrative close. Lot of those going through lately? She asked. He looked at the folder, looked at her, said nothing. Never mind, she said pleasantly and moved on. She was almost to the end of the corridor when she heard the door close again behind her. She made a note, AR closures volume. Who's signing? The afternoon brought the heat that East Coast training facilities accumulated in layers, the sun hitting the tarmac and bouncing back up, the accumulated breath and exertion of several hundred people in motion, the particular weight of high humidity that turned your clothes into a second skin by 1,400. Elena had changed nothing about her pace or her expression. She was crossing the main training yard at 1,412 when she heard the voice again. Maddox, different bay, same register. She didn't change course, just adjusted her angle by about 15 degrees, enough to bring the source into her peripheral vision without making the adjustment obvious. He was running a combat drill with a fire team of 4 privates. The drill itself was textbook room clearing sequence, stack formation, door breach, standard CQB movement. She'd run the same drill herself more times than she could count, in conditions that made this training environment look like a spa. But she wasn't watching the drill. She was watching how he ran it. What is wrong with you? His voice cut across the yard. Martinez, what was that? What that entry? You call that a breach? Private Martinez, she could see the name tape, now reset to the starting position, the mechanical compliance of a man who knew that explanation and justification were not available options. Again, Maddox said, they ran it again. Martinez's entry looked, to Elena's trained eye, within acceptable parameters. Not elegant, but functionally correct, again. The fire team exchanged no looks. That was the tell. In healthy units, Marines running a drill exchanged looks, frustration, solidarity. The small human communication of this is a lot, but we're in it together. These 4 had their faces forward and their eyes forward, and nothing passing between them that could be read by the wrong person. She'd been on ranges with units like this. She knew what came next, statistically. Complaint withdrawals, reassignment requests, the occasional sudden administrative discharge that showed up in the records as a performance issue. She wrote for 2 minutes without stopping. When she looked up, Maddox was watching her from across the yard. He came toward her at 1,447. She'd expected it. The radio call that morning had bought her a few hours of hostile distance while he figured out his approach. But Maddox was not a patient man. She'd read enough about him to know that, and the sight of someone writing things down in his training yard while he ran his drills had evidently reached whatever threshold he worked with. He had 2 Marines with him this time. She clocked them without obviously looking. Keller, a corporal, big through the chest, uncomfortable expression. Briggs, a lance corporal, younger, following Maddox's lead with the specific attention of someone still deciding what he was willing to do. You're still here, Maddox said. I said I would be. What have you been writing down? Notes. About what? About what I've observed. She capped her pen. That's generally what notes are for. You've been observing my training drills. His voice had a new quality now, not the performance contempt from the morning, but something with more heat behind it. She'd gotten under something. Good. You've been making my Marines uncomfortable, interrupting operations. I haven't interrupted anything. You've been standing in active training areas, which I'm authorized to do. I want to know who authorized you. He stepped closer. She didn't step back. That radio call this morning was operations, not command. That's not the same thing. I want to see your credentials in full, and I want your CO's contact information. And I want minus Sergeant. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You asked me these questions this morning. The answers haven't changed. Then you can explain them to the security office. I won't be going to the security office. I'm not asking. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Keller, and then at Briggs, and then back at Maddox. She let the silence do some work. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "I'm going to tell you one more time, clearly, so there's no misunderstanding later. I have full authorization to be on this installation, in this area, conducting this review. If you have concerns about that authorization, the appropriate channel is to contact your commanding officer, not to physically escort me anywhere. We'll let the CO sort it out at the security office." He nodded at Keller, and Keller moved to her right. Briggs moved to her left, and Maddox stepped directly in front of her, his hand coming up toward her wrist, a practiced neck motion. She could tell the motion of a man who'd done this before in a situation where nobody was watching, and it had always worked out in his favor. She said it quietly, clearly. "One final time. Don't touch me." He touched her. In the half second before his hand made contact, she had already calculated 4 variables: his grip strength based on hand size, and the speed of the reach, Keller's position at her right, and the likely delay before he reacted, the surface condition of the tarmac, and the distance to the equipment rack at the edge of the bay that she wanted no part of ending up near. His fingers closed around her wrist, and then Sergeant Cole Maddox, 230 pounds of decorated Marine Corps NCO, was no longer standing. She hadn't thrown him. It was more precise than that. She'd used the forward momentum of his reach, applied 2 points of contact with specific angled pressure, and redirected the energy along a path his body had no way to counter without adequate warning. The whole thing took less than 2 seconds and covered less than 4 feet of ground. He hit the tarmac on his side, arm extended in the direction he'd been reaching. Nothing broken, nothing permanently damaged. But he was on the ground, and the entire training yard had stopped. Every drill, every movement exercise, every Marine within sightline of the Eastern Bay. Boots had stopped moving. Commands had stopped coming. The only sound was the distant mechanical hum of the motor pool and the very specific quality of silence that descended when approximately 60 people experienced the same collective loss of context simultaneously. Dust settled around Maddox's shoulder. He pushed himself up. Elena had stepped back to her original position. Both hands were visible. Her notepad was still in her left hand. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't changed her expression. Keller hadn't moved. He was standing exactly where he'd been, and his face was doing something complicated. Briggs had taken a step backward, not a retreat, just a step that created some distance between where he was and whatever category of situation this had become. Maddox was on his feet. His face was a specific shade of red that she recognized as the particular mixture of genuine pain and profound humiliation, the kind that came from being physically outmatched in a public setting by someone you'd categorized as not a threat. She'd seen it before. She knew what usually came next. He came at her again. She didn't let him get close. This time she moved laterally before he could establish grip, not running, not retreating, just declining to be where his hands were going. He was stronger. She was faster and better at geometry. He committed to a second grab, and she wasn't there for it, the motion carrying him, 2 steps past her original position. "I'm not fighting you," she said. Her voice was steady enough that it carried. "I'm simply not letting you put your hands on me." He stopped, not because he wanted to, because the second failed attempt had done something to the calculation. Suddenly, the physical approach was no longer a solution. It was a problem, and he was standing in front of 60 Marine trying to work out what came next. Keller. His voice was controlled now. The heat had gone somewhere else. "Briggs, take her, hold." The new voice came from the edge of the yard. She didn't turn to look immediately. She knew the voice, had read the name in the file, had been waiting to see where this individual positioned himself in the situation. She finished watching Maddox's face before she turned. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Ortiz was standing at the edge of the bay with his arms at his sides and his expression that was doing something Elena recognized, the expression of a man who had just watched something he'd been half expecting for a while and was now was now having to decide very quickly what he was going to do about it. He was looking at Maddox. Then he looked at Elena. Then he looked at the yard full of Marines who were watching all of them. "Everybody back to your stations," he said. Now. The yard moved. Not fast enough to be panicked, but fast enough to be real. People needed to be somewhere else, and Ortiz had given them a reason to be there. Keller and Briggs withdrew with the others. Maddox stayed. Cole, Ortiz said, and the use of the first name was its own kind of information. These were men who knew each other in the specific way that long-service NCOs knew each other, shared deployments, shared institutional history, the complicated loyalty of people who had been through things together that other people didn't understand. "Stand down. She's an unauthorized—" Radio already cleared her. Ortiz's voice was flat. "This morning. I heard it." Maddox's jaw tightened. "I want to know who she is. That's above my pay grade right now." Ortiz glanced at Elena. It was a neutral glance, not hostile, not welcoming, just assessing. "Ma'am. Gunnery Sergeant. Is there anything you need right now? Or should my sergeant and I get back to?" "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." Ortiz nodded once. He put a hand on Maddox's arm, not a grab, just a contact, a direction, and walked him toward the far side of the bay. Elena watched them go. Then she looked down at her notepad. She wrote down 1,447, physical contact attempt, 2 witnesses, Keller and Briggs. Ortiz response time, positioning, decision to de-escalate. Note: Ortiz knew about the radio call and didn't intervene until second attempt. Reason unclear. She capped the pen. Around her, the training yard slowly returned to its rhythms. Drills resumed. Commands came back. The noise of a functioning installation filled in the space where silence had been. But things were different now. She could feel it in the way people moved, not looking at her, but aware of exactly where she was. The math had changed. She had not, as Max had assumed, been nobody. She turned back toward the administrative building. She had files to find. The records office was technically closed to unauthorized personnel after 1,500. The corporal behind the desk, a young woman named Simmons, according to her name tape, gave Elena's credentials the same long look the gate guard had given them that morning, arrived at the same conclusion, and unlocked the door to the filing room with the expression of someone who had decided this was above her pay grade. "I'll need to log the access," Simmons said. "Log it," Elena said. "That's fine." She spent 40 minutes in the filing room. What she found was not chaos. That was the first thing she noted. Chaos would have been easier to dismiss the records of an overwhelmed administrative staff trying to manage more volume than they had capacity for. What she found instead was a system, careful, specific, operating on a consistent logic that only became visible if you were looking at enough records at once. Complaint reports filed by junior Marines against non-commissioned officers, 19 in the past 14 months. She found the cross-references and follow-up documentation for 11 of them. 8 had been closed administratively signed off at the 04 level, Major J. Dawson with notations that cited insufficient evidence or voluntary withdrawal by the complainant. He looked at the withdrawal records. 3 of the complainant transferred off the installation within 30 days of the withdrawal. 2 of those transfers had been flagged as voluntary by the Marines in question. She found the flag for one of them, a PFC named Corvino. She recognized the name from the conversation in the chow hall, and the withdrawal notation was dated 11 days before the transfer. Then she found the transfer order, and the date on the transfer order was 6 days before the withdrawal notation. She sat very still in the filing room for a moment. The order of events, according to the records, Corvino had been transferred on the 14th. His complaint withdrawal had been processed on the 20th. But you couldn't withdraw a complaint after you'd already been transferred. You had to be present to sign the withdrawal form, and the base required in-person signatures on complaint documentation, which meant either the withdrawal documentation had been backdated or someone had signed it who wasn't Corpino. She photographed the documents with her phone. Then she kept looking. By the time she left the filing room, she had documented 4 similar irregularities and had enough cross-reference data to identify the pattern clearly. The complaints were being closed up before investigation. The closures were being signed by Dawson, and the Marines whose complaints were being closed were, with a statistical frequency that could not be coincidental, being removed from the installation shortly afterward. It was not a sloppy system. It had been running for some time, long enough to have developed procedural smoothness, long enough that the people inside it, the ones doing the filing, the ones processing the transfers, had probably stopped thinking of it as a system at all. It was just how things got handled. She walked out of the records building at 1552 and stood in the afternoon light for a moment, looking at the training yard where, 4 hours earlier, Maddox had reached for her wrist and discovered his mistake. He thought he'd miscalculated with a civilian. He had no idea what he'd actually set in motion. She took out her phone and placed a secure call. It rang twice. "It's Voss," she said. "I need to flag something for command tomorrow morning. Can you confirm availability of a helicopter and a senior officer for an arrival at 800? She listened. "Good," she said. "Tell them to bring Dawson's personnel file." She hung up. Across the yard, through the window of the NCO office, she could see Maddox at a desk. He was on the phone. His posture was rigid, and he was speaking with the urgency of a man trying to solve a problem before it got any bigger. He was already too late. She had been taking notes since 831 that morning, and notes, in her experience, had a way of becoming something much more significant by the time morning came. She turned and walked toward her temporary quarters, her boots steady on the tarmac, her face calm, her notepad closed. She had everything she needed. What she didn't yet know was that Maddox had made one call she hadn't anticipated. Not to legal, not to operations, but to someone whose name didn't appear in file she'd found that afternoon. And that call was about to change her timeline. The call Maddox had made wasn't to his JAGI contact or to the base legal officer. Elena found that out in 2017 when Ortiz knocked on the door of her temporary quarters. She'd been expecting someone. She hadn't been certain it would be him. She opened the door and looked at him. He was out of uniform civilian clothes, a plain gray t-shirt and cargo pants, the kind of outfit that said, "I'm not here officially." He had a paper coffee cup in one hand that he wasn't drinking from. "Gunnery Sergeant," she said. "I'm off the clock," he said. Is this a bad time?" She stepped back from the door. He came in and stood in the middle of the small room with the coffee cup in his hand and looked at the papers crusts she'd spread across the desk without looking at them long enough to actually read them. "Maddox called Dawson," he said, "after you left the yard. About 40 minutes after." She sat on the edge of the desk. "I assumed he'd called someone. Dawson came to the NCO office at around 1800. They were in there for almost an hour. He looked at the cup in his hand like he'd forgotten he was holding it. I don't know what they talked about, but when Dawson left, Cole Maddox, he had a different kind of quiet on him. Not the pissed-off kind, the other kind. The kind that means he's waiting," she said. Ortiz looked at her. Yeah, she was quiet for a moment, letting him finish arriving at whatever he'd come here to say. Men like Ortiz didn't make unofficial evening visits without having thought through what they wanted out of them. He was here because he'd made a calculation, and she wanted to understand the terms of it before she responded. "What do you need from me?" she asked. He set the coffee cup on the corner of the desk. "I've been here 4 years," he said. "Blackridge. Same posting. I had 3 chances to move, and I turned them all down because I don't know. It felt like leaving something unfinished." He looked at the wall. "I've filed 2 complaints in 4 years. Neither of them went anywhere. One of them I withdrew myself because someone made it very clear that pursuing it was going to create problems for the complainant, not for the subject. She noted the word complainant, not I. He'd withdrawn his own complaint, but was describing it in the third person, which meant he wasn't here to talk about himself. He was here to talk about someone else. The second complaint, she said. His jaw shifted. Ruiz filed it 8 weeks ago. I was her witness. I signed the supporting documentation. He picked the cup up and put it down, again, without drinking. 3 weeks later, I got a memo saying the complaint had been closed. Insufficient evidence. Voluntary withdrawal by the complainant. He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd come in. Dana Ruiz did not withdraw that complaint. I was with her the morning she was supposed to have signed the withdrawal form. We were on a range exercise from 630 to 1,400. She couldn't have been in the records office. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Do you have documentation of the range exercise? Sign-in sheets. My name and hers, plus 9 others. He reached into his back pocket and produced a folded photocopy. She took it and looked at it. The dates matched what she'd found in the filing room. Can I keep this? I made it for you, he said. She set it on the desk. Why are you bringing this to me? You don't know who I am. He was quiet for a second. You came through the gate this morning with no rank and authorization that made 2 different senior NCOs shut their mouths. You spent the day watching the installation and writing things down. And when Maddox put his hand on you, you put him on the ground without raising your voice. He picked up the coffee cup one more time, and this time actually drank from it. I've been in the Corps long enough to know what a routine administrative visit looks like. This isn't that. She didn't confirm or deny it. What do you want out of this? She asked. Be straight with me. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, and in that moment she could see something she'd been watching for. Since she'd first seen his name in the file, the specific weariness of a man who had done things correctly for a long time in an environment that hadn't rewarded it. He wasn't broken, but he was tired in a way that had settled into the bone. I want Dana Ruiz to get a fair process, he said. And I want the other ones to get a fair process. And I want to still be here when it's over. He paused. Is that too much to ask? No, she said. It's not. He stood up. Maddox will try something before morning. I don't know what. But when he's in that quiet mode, he's not done. He's just waiting to find a different angle. Noted, she said. He moved to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, he said. What you did on the yard today, the way you handled it, a lot of people saw it. Not just the one standing there. Word moves fast on a small installation. He paused. Some of them are going to sleep better tonight. He left. She looked at the photocopy on the desk for a while. Then she picked up her pen and made a new notation in her notepad. Ortiz credible. Documentation of forged withdrawal Ruiz. Range records confirm alibi. Cross-reference with Dawson signature on closure. Build the chain. Then she sat back and thought about what Maddox's quiet meant. She didn't sleep much. Not because she was fear had a specific texture, and this wasn't it. It was more that sleep felt like a poor allocation of the next several hours. She lay down for 2 hours with the lights off, running through what she had and what she still needed, arranging it in the particular spatial way. Her brain had always organized information, not as a list, but as a map, with distances and connections, and the specific locations of gaps that still needed filling. At 230, she got up, made instant coffee with the in-room setup, and sat at the desk with her notepad and the photographs she'd taken in the records office. The Corvino situation was the cleanest piece of evidence. The timeline didn't lie. The transfer order predated the withdrawal notation by 6 days. Someone had signed a form after the signatory had already left the installation. Either Corvino had come back to sign it, which was logistically possible, but Operails had signed it, or someone else had signed it. And someone else signing a complaint withdrawal form on behalf of the complainant was not an administrative irregularity. It had another name. She built the chain from Corvino outward. 3 other cases showed similar irregularities, closures that didn't align with the complainant's documented locations on the dates in question, transfer orders that preceded the formal resolution paperwork. The signatures on the closure documents were consistent. Dawson, sometimes alone, sometimes with a second signature from the records coordinator, a Staff Sergeant Hale, whose name she added to her working list. Hale might be complicit, or he might be a conduit, someone who processed what he was handed without asking questions, because asking questions had consequences. She'd know more when she talked to him. That was on the schedule for the morning. She also kept thinking about what Ortiz had said. Maddox will try something before morning. The quiet mode. She'd seen men like Maddox in various contexts over the years, and she knew the pattern. The open aggression, when it failed, didn't disappear. It changed form, became procedural, became a phone call to someone with a larger platform, a formal complaint, a request to question her credentials through official channels that might take long enough to create operational disruption. Or it became something less official. She got up at 4:30 and did an hour of movement work in the small space between the desk and the wall, nothing elaborate, just enough to keep her body honest. At 5:45, she showered, dressed, and walked out of the building before the installation was fully awake. The base at 600 had a specific quality she'd always liked. The institutional machinery not yet at full operation, a handful of early risers running PT routes, the chow hall crew starting their prep work, the motor pool beginning its first maintenance checks of the day. The sounds were mechanical and purposeful, and the air had a brief window of coolness before the heat reasserted itself. She was crossing toward the administrative building when she saw the vehicle. A black government specification sedan, parked at an angle near the main entrance to the administrative complex that was slightly wrong, not in a designated space, not close enough to the entrance to suggest someone who worked there, but not far enough away to suggest a visitor who'd followed protocol. The angle said someone who had stopped in a hurry, or who was comfortable enough with this space to not bother with the designated area. She adjusted her route, not directly toward it, just enough to bring the sedan into better peripheral view as she passed. The sedan was empty, but the engine was still warm. She could see the slight shimmer of heat off the hood in the early morning air. Whoever had driven it had arrived recently. She noted the plate number in her notepad without stopping. The administrative building was technically open at 600 for duty staff. She went through the main entrance and moved down the corridor with her footsteps quiet on the linoleum. The records office was dark, door locked. The operations center down the hall had its lights on. She could see the glow under the door, hear the low traffic of radio communications. She was passing the operations center door when it opened. Major James Dawson stepped out. He was in a fresh uniform, which meant either he'd been here all night or he'd come in very early specifically to be fresh and presentable. She put her money on the latter. He was early 50s, silver at the temples, the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years ago and had since settled into an authority it wore like a comfortable coat. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who had spent the previous evening being informed about her and was now meeting her for the first time with the deliberate advantage of preparation. "You're Voss," he said. "Major Dawson," she said. "I heard about the incident on the training yard yesterday." He said it conversationally, like he was mentioning the weather. "Sergeant Maddox has filed a formal complaint. Excessive force during an authorized security intervention." She looked at him. "I understand. I'm going to need to review your authorization documentation in full before you continue operating on this installation. That's my prerogative as the senior officer on site." "It is," she said, "and I'm happy to provide documentation." She paused one beat. "I'll also need the full administrative records for complaint resolutions over the past 18 months. Originals, not copies, signed by the originating NCO." His expression didn't change, but something did a very small shift in the quality of his stillness. The specific stillness of a man calculating a response to something he hadn't expected. That's an unusual request. It's within the scope of my review. What review, specifically? You haven't identified yourself beyond a first name and a vague authorization. The identification will be provided through command channels at 800, she said. At which point, the scope of the review will also be formalized. If you'd like to expedite that, I'm happy to make a call right now and move the timeline up. She held his gaze. He held hers. The corridor was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a radio crackled. 8 o'clock, he said finally. 8 o'clock, she agreed. He walked past her toward his office. She watched him go, watching the set of his shoulders, the precision of his pace. He walked like a man managing something containing it rather than carrying it naturally. She'd seen that gait before. She pulled out her phone and called the number she'd called the night before. Move the helicopter to 800, she said, when it picked up. And tell them to bring everything. The chow hall at 630 was moderately populated, and Elena took her tray to a table near the window with a sightline to the main administrative entrance and ate a breakfast she could actually taste, which was not always something she prioritized on working mornings. She was finishing her coffee when Ruiz came in. The private moved through the chow line with the head-down efficiency of someone who had learned to complete necessary tasks without making herself visible while doing them. She took her tray to a table near the back wall and sat facing the room's survival instinct. Elena thought the kind of spatial awareness that developed in people who needed to see what was coming. She was wearing clean BDUs, hair pinned back correctly, boots properly laced. Whatever was happening to her at Blackridge, she hadn't let it reach her uniform. Elena watched her for a moment, then picked up her tray and walked to the back wall. Private Ruiz. Ruiz looked up. Recognition crossed her face. She'd been in the training yard yesterday, followed immediately by a careful, neutral expression. A younger Marine trying to read a situation, without revealing how much the situation was costing her. "Ma'am," she said, "mind if I sit?" A pause. "No, ma'am." Elena sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Elena let it stay that way, eating the last of her eggs while Ruiz stared at her tray. "You don't have to say anything," Elena said. "I'm not here to interview you right now." "I know, ma'am, do you?" Ruiz looked up. Her eyes were dark and steady and very tired in the way that specific kind of tired that settled in people who weren't sleeping because their brain wouldn't stop running problem-solving loops for situations that didn't have available solutions. She was maybe 21 years old, and she had the exhaustion of someone twice that. "I filed a complaint," Ruiz said. "It was closed. It doesn't matter." "It matters. It didn't go anywhere. It'll go somewhere," Elena said. "That's what I'm here for." Ruiz was quiet. She picked up her fork and set it down without using it. "Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz told me I should talk to someone if I got the chance." She paused. "He didn't say who. He's a good Marine," Elena said. "He's the only reason I'm still here." She said it flatly, without drama. "I put in for reassignment twice. Both times it came back denied. No explanation, just denied." She looked at the tray. 3 girls I know from the first training cycle, they're all gone, transferred out, or they separated. 2 of them were better Marines than me. What happened to them? I don't know, exactly. Everybody just stopped talking about them. She picked up the fork again, and this time used it, moving food around without eating it. You learn real fast here that asking questions it's a tax. Everything you ask costs you something. Elena looked at her. "When I came through yesterday, on the training ground, when Maddox had you reassembling the radio." Ruiz's jaw tightened. "That wasn't the first time," Elena said. "It wasn't a question." "No, ma'am." "How long?" "Since week 3 of my first cycle here." She put the fork down. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's the equipment getting reset. Sometimes it's extra PT assigned right before a scheduled evaluation. Sometimes it's just standing close. staying in your space until you react and then making the reaction your fault. She said it without emotion, which was its own kind of testimony. People who'd emotionally processed something stopped describing it in that flat documentary tone. She hadn't processed it yet. She was still living inside it. I tried to go to the IG office twice. The first time, Sergeant Hale at Records told me the IG rep wasn't on site and I could submit a written complaint. I submitted it. 3 weeks later, someone told me it was closed. A pause. I never talked to an IG rep. Elena wrote in her notepad. "Are you actually going to do something?" Ruiz asked. There was no hope in the question. It was purely informational. She was trying to calibrate whether to invest in the possibility. "Yes," Elena said. Ruiz looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the training yard. "He knows something's happening. Maddox. Yesterday after what happened on the yard, he came to the barracks. Didn't do anything. Just walked through. Making sure people saw him walking through." She paused. "That's what he does when he's reminding people that he's still there." Elena made a note. "Did he say anything to you?" "No. He never says anything when he does that." Ruiz picked up her coffee cup. That's the point. The chow hall was filling up around them. Elena finished her coffee and stood. "Stay on your normal schedule today," she said. "Don't change anything. If anyone approaches you and asks you to sign anything, or tell you a complaint has been resolved or needs updating, don't sign anything. Come find me first." Ruiz looked up at her. "How do I find you?" Elena wrote her temporary quarters extension on the corner of a notepad page, tore it off, and set it on the tray. "If you can't reach me directly, find Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz." She picked up her tray. "Ma'am." Ruiz's voice stopped her. "Yesterday, when you put Maddox on the ground." She hesitated. "Did it feel as good as it looked?" Elena looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, but related to one. "I was defending myself," she said. She walked her tray to the return window and left the chow hall. The next 90 minutes happened in the compressed, overlapping way mornings before scheduled confrontations tended to happen, multiple things moving simultaneously, each one feeding into the others, the pressure building incrementally like weather. At 712, Staff Sergeant Hale came to her temporary quarters. He knocked twice, quickly, with the specific rhythm of someone who was nervous about being seen. She opened the door. He was younger than she'd expected from the Record's middle 30s. Brown hair, going gray at the sides, a face that had recently been through something uncomfortable and hadn't finished resolving it. He had his hands at his sides, and his posture was stiff in a way that wasn't military-bearing. It was the stiffness of someone who'd made a decision and was having second thoughts about it, while simultaneously too far through the door to stop. "I'm Staff Sergeant Thomas Hale," he said. "Records office." "I know who you are," Elena said. "Come in." He came in and didn't sit down. "I processed some of those closures. The complaint closures." He said it quickly, like he'd rehearsed getting through the sentence and didn't want to slow down. "I want to be clear, I signed the processing documentation, not the closure determinations. The closures come from Major Dawson's office. My signature is just the administrative processor." "I understand the distinction," she said. I want to make sure that's documented. That distinction." "Sit down, Staff Sergeant." He sat. He had his hands on his knees, and he was looking at the floor. "The Corvino withdrawal," she said. His hands tightened on his knees. "I processed the paperwork. Corvino was off installation when the withdrawal form is dated." He didn't answer. "Did you know that when you processed it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I had the form. It had a signature. It wasn't my job to verify the date against the transfer records." He looked up. His eyes were doing something uncomfortable. "I'm not saying that's a defense. I'm saying that's what happened." Elena looked at him steadily. "Who brought you the form?" "Major Dawson's clerk." "Staff Sergeant Patton." He paused. "Patton told me it had already been reviewed and just needed administrative processing. I'd been told before to expedite forms from the Major's office. How many times did that happen? Another long pause. 4, maybe 5. Over about 14 months. She wrote it down. Am I in trouble? He asked. That depends on what you do between now and 800, she said. I need you to pull the originals of every complaint closure you processed in the last 18 months and have them in the records room before 8 o'clock. Everyone. In the original folders, not copies. If Major Dawson finds out Major Dawson is going to have other things occupying him. At 800, she said. Can you do that? He stood up. His hands weren't quite steady. Yes, he said. Go now. He went. Elena closed the door and stood in the quiet room for a moment. She looked at her notepad, at the accumulating weight of it, the names, the dates, the inconsistencies that were no longer individual anomalies, but a pattern with a shape and a signature. The picture was almost complete. There were still witnesses she'd want to confirm, still witnesses she hadn't spoken with, but the structural architecture of what had happened at Blackridge over the past 14 months was now clear enough to act on. What she needed the next 90 minutes to be was uncomplicated. What they were about to be was the opposite. At 741, her phone buzzed. A text from an unsaved number 1 she recognized as a base internal transfer format. The message was 4 words. They know about tonight. She stared at it. Tonight didn't refer to anything that had happened the previous evening. She hadn't told anyone about her call to command. She hadn't mentioned the helicopter to command, except the person and anyone except the person on the other end of the line. She read the text again. 4 words. They bout tonight. The only people who could have intercepted or inferred the call were either on the command end, which she trusted, or on the installation end, which meant either her temporary quarters had been compromised or someone inside the command loop had talked. The timing was tight. Dawson had been in the operations center at 600. The operations center had radio communications equipment that a senior officer could theoretically access. She thought about Dawson's face in the corridor, the careful calm of it. The man who'd come in early and pressed his uniform and prepared his conversation and come out of the operations center at exactly the right moment to intercept her. He hadn't just been briefing himself on her. He'd been making calls. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at her watch. 743. 17 minutes. She picked up her notepad, zipped her bag, and left the room. Whatever Dawson had arranged for this morning, she needed to be positioned before it arrived, not reacting to it from an unprepared location. She moved toward the administrative building at a pace that was not quite a walk and not quite something faster, her face calm and her mind running the available geometry of the next 17 minutes. Somewhere on the other side of the installation, she could already hear faint, not yet visible, but unmistakable, the distant sound of a helicopter. It was early. That meant command had moved the timeline too. She didn't know yet whether that was because of her call last night or because of something else entirely. She didn't know what Dawson had said on whatever call he'd made from the operations center. She didn't know the content of the message Maddox had carried to his meeting with Dawson, or what had been agreed in that hour-long conversation in the NCO office. What she knew was the shape of the board and the positions on it, and she had enough experience to understand that the next few minutes were going to tell her which version of the morning, and this actually was the controlled one she'd planned, or the complicated one she'd need to navigate. She was almost at the administrative building when she saw Maddox. He was standing at the corner of the building in uniform with Keller beside him. Not moving, just standing, positioned where the sightlines to the main entrance and the helipad and the records office all converged. The specific positioning of a man who had thought about angles. He saw her at the same moment. She saw him. He didn't move. She didn't change her pace. The helicopter sound was louder, now close enough that other people on the base were beginning to look up. 2 Marines near the motor pool had stopped what they were doing and turned toward the sound. A group of privates on a morning run slowed as they passed the helipad access road. Maddox's eyes moved between Elena and the sound of the helicopter and back to Elena. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackridge, she saw something in his face that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not contempt, not the particular performance of authority she'd been watching him run since 831 the previous morning. Something quieter than that. Something that happened in the back of the jaw and the muscles around the eyes when a man began to understand, against his preference, that the category he'd placed someone in was wrong, and that the miscategorization had not been a minor error. The helicopter broke the tree line to the east. It was not a standard installation transport. It was a command configuration. She knew the sound signature, the rotor rhythm, and it was descending toward the helipad on the direct approach rather than the standard traffic pattern, which meant its arrivals had been coordinated with the control tower on a priority authorization. Maddox was looking at it now. She walked past him without stopping, 4 feet of clearance, close enough that she could hear him draw a slow breath through his nose. He didn't say anything. She didn't either. She pushed through the door of the administrative building and moved to a position in the entrance corridor, where she could see both the main door and the hallway leading to Dawson's office, and the hallway leading to the records room. And she stood there with her notepad in her hand, her bag over her shoulder, and waited. The helicopter set down. The rotors began to cycle down. And then, from the direction of Dawson's office, she heard his door open, not the click of a routine departure, but the sound of a door pulled open with some urgent steps that were too fast for the distance, and then deliberately slowed. A man who'd heard the helicopter and was trying to arrive at the entrance before it did, while not appearing to have hurried. Dawson came around the corner into the main corridor and stopped when he saw her standing there. They looked at each other. The rotors outside were still spinning down, the sound filling the corridor through the walls. "Major," she said. His jaw was tight. His uniform was immaculate. He looked like a man holding himself together with both hands. "The helicopter is early," he said. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her for another moment, and she could see the calculation running behind his eyes. Everything he'd put together, everything he'd planned for this morning, measuring it against whatever the helicopter's early arrival meant for his timeline. "This isn't what you think it is," he said. "Whatever you've been told, whatever you think you found in those records, inscribe Major Dawson." Her voice was quiet and flat, and it stopped him the way a hand on a door stops a door. "Whatever you were going to say in the next 30 seconds, I need you to think about. Whether you want to have said it." He closed his mouth. Outside, the rotors stopped. In the silence that followed, they could hear boots on the helipad access road, measured, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who knew where they were going and wasn't in a rush to get there. The main door to the administrative building opened. Dawson turned. Elena didn't turn. She kept her psychologically, professionally. She kept her eyes on Dawson's face, watching it with the specific attention of someone who understood that what happened in the next 30 seconds was going to determine a great deal about what came after for Blackridge. For the Marines whose names were in her notepad. For the cases that had been closed before they should have been opened. She heard the footsteps stop behind her. She heard the sharp, precise sound of a salute. And she heard a voice she recognized say, "Colonel Voss." Reporting as requested. The color left Dawson's face. Not all at once. It went in stages, first the forehead, then the area around the mouth, last the jaw. Like a man watching something arrive that he'd convinced himself wasn't coming. Elena turned around. The officer in the doorway was a full-bird colonel named Hartwell, whom she'd worked with twice before and trusted with specific things. He had a classified folder under his left arm and a look on his face that said he had been briefed on the full situation and was prepared for most versions of what happened next. He looked at Elena, then he looked at Dawson. "Major," he said pleasantly, "I think you should get your sergeant. We're going to need the formation." Dawson didn't move for 3 full seconds. That was long enough for it to mean something. In Elena's experience, 3 seconds was the window where men decided not consciously, not with deliberation, but at some deeper and more honest level what they were actually made of. Some of them straightened up in those 3 seconds. Mass. Some of them deflated. Some of them, the ones she'd learned to watch most carefully, went very still in a way that meant they were looking for the exit. Dawson went still. Then he said, "I'll need to verify your authorization. Colonel Hartwell, before I assemble." Major. Hartwell's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He had the particular register of a man who had given orders in loud places and quiet places, and had learned that volume was not the variable that mattered. The formation. Now. The word now sat in the corridor like a physical object. Dawson looked at Elena once more, a look she read clearly, the specific look of a man filing something away, adjusting his immediate strategy while keeping a longer calculation running, and then he turned and walked toward the operations center. Hartwell waited until the sound of his footsteps had receded. Then he turned to Elena. "You look like you slept 4 hours," he said. 2, she said. "How much did they give you on the flight in?" "Enough." He handed her the classified folder. "Command received an interesting communication at 5:30 this morning. Formal request from a Major James Dawson, routed through the installation's legal office, questioning the authorization, says, for an unnamed civilian conducting an unauthorized review of command-sensitive records." He paused. The request cited a potential breach of administrative protocol and asked for the review to be suspended pending verification. Elena opened the folder and scanned the top document. He sent it at 5:30, which means he was either up all night or up very early. He was in the operations center. When I walked through at 600, she closed the folder. He had access to communication equipment. He could have intercepted or inferred my call last night. Hartwell looked at her steadily. Did he? I don't know what he actually heard. But he knew enough to send that request before 600. She handed the folder back. What did command do with it? Moved my departure up by 40 minutes and added 2 items to the folder. He tucked it back under his arm. The request has been formally received and formally set aside. Dawson will find out about that in approximately 15 minutes when this formation begins. She nodded. Through the corridor window, she could see movement on the main parade. Ground Marines being called in from the training bays, NCOs directing the assembly. Word moved fast on a small installation. Within 3 minutes, most of Blackridge would be standing in formation, wondering what the helicopter had brought. "Records," she said. "I need access to originals before we begin." Staff Sergeant Hale is pulling them now. "How confident are you in Hale?" 60%. He processed forms he shouldn't have processed without asking questions. But he came to me voluntarily at 712. She paused. He's scared enough to cooperate and guilty enough that cooperation is in his interest. And Ortiz? He's the reason I have the range documentation on the Ruiz withdrawal. She looked toward the parade ground. I'd keep him where he can be seen. He's a stabilizing presence, and the junior Marines know it. Hartwell absorbed this. Maddox? I saw him outside when the helicopter came in. She thought about his face, the draining of it, the recalibration happening behind his eyes. He's done the math. He doesn't know exactly what he's standing in front of, but he knows it's bigger than yesterday. Good, Hartwell said. Let him keep doing it. He moved toward the main entrance. She fell into step beside him, 1 pace back on his left, the position of someone who knew the appropriate geometry of this moment. "One more thing," she said. He glanced at her without slowing. "Someone sent me a text at 741. 4 words. They know about tonight. Unsaved number. Base internal transfer format. I don't know who sent it, and I don't know what tonight referred to. I hadn't discussed any plans for tonight with anyone on this installation." Hartwell's pace didn't change, but his jaw shifted slightly. "I'll want that phone before we're done," he said. "You'll have it." He pushed through the main door and walked out into the morning light, and Elena walked out behind him into whatever came next. The formation was not perfect. That was the first thing she noticed as she took a position at the edge of the parade ground, not in the formation, not in the officer cluster near the front, but at the lateral edge where she could see the whole field at once. 340-something Marines assembling in the standard configuration, company-grade officers in their positions, NCOs, moving the enlisted ranks into alignment. The machinery of military formation worked the same way everywhere, and the machine at Blackridge ran correctly on the surface. But surfaces were not what she was watching. She was watching the way people positioned themselves relative to other people. The physical distance that individual Marines created between themselves and specific NCOs. The way certain clusters of junior enlisted moved to stand near Ortiz's section rather than their assigned positions. Small deviations that in a healthy unit would mean nothing, and in this unit meant everything. She was watching faces who looked straight ahead with genuine blankness, and who was straight ahead blankness, and who was straight ahead with effort, managing something underneath. She was watching Maddox. He was in his correct position with his section, spine straight, face forward, the whole physical architecture of a man maintaining bearing under conditions that were testing it. Keller was in his assigned slot behind him. Briggs was 2 positions to the right, and he had the look of someone who had made a decision sometime overnight that he hadn't fully processed yet, a forward-facing posture with too much thought behind the eyes. Ruiz was in formation 3 rows from the back. Elena found her and held her location in her peripheral awareness. The private was still. Correct. The specific stillness of someone who had been told to trust a process, and was now watching the process arrive, and trying to decide if it was actually what it had been described as. Hartwell walked to the front of the formation and stood. He didn't call it to attention. That order came from the duty NCO, a master sergeant Elena hadn't met, competent on the evidence, who called the command and brought 340 bodies to the same position, simultaneously with the particular sound that mass military compliance made, a collective snap of boot heels, and the absolute silence that followed it. Hartwell let the silence run for 4 seconds. "At ease," he said. "Stand easy." The formation shifted to parade rest. Less rigid, but still formal, still listening. "I'm Colonel Richard Hartwell," he said. "I'm attached to the Commanding General's Inspection and Review Division. I arrived this morning at the request of a senior officer currently conducting a formal review of administrative and command practices at this installation." He paused. "That review has been underway since yesterday. It will continue today. There will be individual interviews conducted through the afternoon, and there will be a formal findings presentation before this formation stands down this evening." A murmur moved through the formation, not a word, just the specific quality of sound that happened when several hundred people simultaneously processed something unexpected. In the meantime, Hartwell said, "This installation will continue its normal training schedule. All personnel will be available for interview when notified. All personnel are reminded that cooperation with a formal command review is not optional, and that obstruction of that process carries consequences defined in the UCMJ." He let that land. Dismissed to training. The formation broke, and Elena turned back toward the administrative building, already moving, because the next phase of the morning had a schedule and she needed to be inside it. She was almost at the building entrance when Maddox caught up with her. She heard him coming. His gait was distinctive. She'd cataloged it the previous day, and she stopped at the door and turned before he reached her. He was alone, which surprised her slightly. She'd expected Keller. He stopped 2 meters away. He looked different than he had the day before. Not smaller, he was the same mass, the same physical presence. Nothing about his body had changed. But something in the organizing principle of him was different. The performance layer, The ambient contempt and institutional authority he'd been running as continuous background that was thinner this morning. Under it was something more honest and more complicated. He wasn't going to reach for her wrist. She could see that clearly. That particular move was done. "I need to know what's in the file," he said. She looked at him. "That's not how this works. I've been at Blackridge for 6 years." 6 years. His voice was controlled, but only just. Not the performance control of the training yard, the real kind, the kind that meant something was pressing hard on the inside of it. "I came up here as a staff sergeant. I built this section." "I know. Then you know that this place was a wreck when I got here. Failure rates, discipline problems, it was a mess. I fixed it. Some of it," she said, "some of it you made worse." His jaw tightened. "Whatever those complaint records say." "Sergeant," she kept her voice level, "I know exactly what you're trying to do right now, and I need you to understand that this conversation is happening after the point where it would have helped you." She paused. "If you had something you wanted to say, the time was yesterday morning, or last night, or before you called Dawson. That window is gone." He looked at her with something she hadn't seen in his face before, not the anger, not the contempt, but something more genuinely human than either. The specific look of a man who had made choices that had accumulated into a situation he couldn't think his way out of, and was only now fully understanding that fact. "The junior Marines in your section," he said. "The ones who've been here a while. I want it on record that not all of it was Sergeant Maddox." Her voice was quiet, firm. "You need to stop talking to me. Right now. You need to go find legal representation. You need to make no further statements to anyone without counsel, and you need to stop making this worse." She held his gaze. "Do you understand me?" He stared at her. Then he nodded once. A small motion. Not submission, more like a man finally accepting the actual coordinates of where he was standing. He turned and walked toward the NCO offices. She watched him go for 3 seconds, then went inside. The records room at 835 had the specific quality of a space that Bissett had been recent and urgently organized. Hale had done what she'd asked. The original complaint files were arranged in chronological order on the long table at the center of the room. 19 folders, each tabbed, each with its original documentation intact, rather than the processed copies she'd reviewed the previous afternoon. He was standing at the far end of the table when she came in. He'd lost more color since 712 and gained more stillness, the specific stillness of a man who'd committed to a direction and was now waiting to see what it cost him. Hartwell came in 2 minutes later, followed by a warrant officer, Elena, recognized as his administrative specialist, a quiet, thorough woman named Vasquez, who carried a secure tablet and moved through spaces like she was trying not to disturb them. "Start from the top," Hartwell said to Elena. She walked them through it. She had rehearsed this mentally during the brief blank hours of the early morning, not the words, which came naturally, but the architecture of the presentation. The order that would make the pattern clearest. She started with Corvino because the date discrepancies was the cleanest, the most undeniable, a 6-day gap between a transfer order and a withdrawal notation that couldn't exist without either deliberate falsification or a significant breakdown in administrative process so severe it was effectively the same thing. She laid the transfer order and the withdrawal notation side by side on the table. Hartwell looked at them. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Dawson's signature is on the closure," he said. "On all 8 closures from the past 14 months." She moved to the next file. "The pattern is consistent. Complaint filed. Closure within 21 days, well before the standard investigation timeline. Closure signed by Dawson. In 4 of the 8 cases, the complainant was transferred or separated within 30 days of the closure." Vasquez was documenting as she went, stylus moving steadily across the tablet. "Ruiz," Hartwell said. "Complaint filed 8 weeks ago. Closure dated 19 days later. Withdrawal notation signed in the complainant's name. She put the range documentation from Ortiz beside the folder. Ruiz was on a range exercise on the date of the withdrawal notation. Sign-in sheet verified by the supervising NCO Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz, whose name is also on the sheet. Hartwell picked up the range documentation. He looked at it carefully. "Who else has seen these originals?" he asked. "You, me, Vasquez, and Hale." She glanced at Hale, who was standing at the end of the table with his hands at his sides. Hale processed the administrative closure forms, but did not originate the withdrawal documentation. Hartwell looked at Hale. "Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir." Hale's voice was steady, effortful. "The withdrawal forms came from Major Dawson's office. I processed them as forwarded. I didn't. I should have verified the signatures more carefully." He stopped. Started again. "I didn't." Hartwell held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at Elena. "Continue." She went through the remaining 6 cases in 20 minutes. Each one added a layer to the architecture of what had been happening at Blackridge, the system that had been running quietly underneath the functional surface of the installation, pressuring people into silence, removing the ones who wouldn't be silenced, maintaining clean statistics at the cost of the Marines those statistics were supposed to represent. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Hartwell closed the last folder. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at the row of 19 files. "Where's Dawson now?" he asked Vasquez. "In his office, sir." "He hasn't left the building." "Get him." Vasquez left. Hartwell looked at Elena. "The text this morning," he said. 4 words. "I don't know who sent it." She paused. "But whoever it was knew about my call to command last night. The call was placed from my quarters. If Dawson or Maddox had the quarters monitored, that would be a separate and significantly more serious problem." Hartwell straightened up. "I want you present for Dawson, but I want you to let me run it." She nodded. "Not because I doubt your capability," he said, with the slight dryness of a man who understood how the sentence might land. "Because you've spent the last 24 hours as the subject of his direct opposition. I want him looking at me, not at you, for as long as possible." He paused. "The moment he's looking at you, he's going to be running his version of what happened instead of answering questions." "Understood," she said. Dawson came into the records room. With the specific bearing of a man who had decided best available move was performance. Straight back. Measured pace. The careful dignity of someone preparing to be wrongly accused and intending to conduct themselves so impeccably that the wrongness would be self-evident. He looked at the files on the table. He looked at Hartwell. He didn't look at Elena. That was deliberate. "Colonel Hartwell." His voice was measured. "I've been advised by the installation legal officer that I'm entitled to representation before any formal minutes." "This is an informal records review," Hartwell said. "You're not being charged with anything at this moment. You're being asked questions about administrative documentation that bears your signature." He gestured to the chair across the table. "Sit down, Major." A pause. Dawson sat. "The complaint closure documentation for the past 14 months, Hartwell said. "You signed 8 administrative closure determinations for complaints filed by junior enlisted personnel against NCOs at this installation." "That's correct," Dawson said, "within my authority as the senior reviewing officer. In each case, the closure was issued within 21 days of the complaint being filed. The timelines reflect the complexity of the individual cases. The standard investigation window for complaints of this nature is 45 to 90 days. The standard window is a guideline, not a requirement." His voice was calm. Prepared, he'd thought about this. "In cases where evidence was insufficient and the complainant indicated a desire to withdraw." "In the Corvino case," Hartwell said, and put the 2 documents side by side in front of Dawson. The transfer order is dated the 14th. The withdrawal notation is dated the 20th. Private Corvino had been transferred off this installation 6 days before the withdrawal form was signed. Dawson looked at the documents. He said nothing. "Major," Hartwell said, The withdrawal form has Corvino's signature on it. Corvino was not on this installation on the date of that signature. Can you explain that? The silence in the room was specific and weighty. Hale, standing at the end of the table, was looking at the wall. Vasquez's stylus had stopped moving. Dawson's jaw moved. Once. I'll need to review those documents more carefully before I can speak to the specific minutes. You signed the closure that references the withdrawal, Hartwell said. Your signature is on the closure, dated the 22nd. You're saying you signed a closure that referenced a withdrawal you can't explain? I'm saying the documentation that was provided to me was minus. Who provided it to you? Another pause. Longer this time. My administrative clerk prepared the closure packages, he said. Staff Sergeant Patton. I reviewed the packages and signed the closures based on the documentation included. So your position is that Patton prepared documentation that included a withdrawal form with a signature that couldn't have been authentic, and you signed a closure based on that without verifying the withdrawal. Dawson's jaw was tight. I operated in good faith on the documentation provided. Hartwell looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man who had heard this particular sentence in this particular context before and knew exactly what it weighed. We're going to need Patton, he said to Vasquez. She's already been located, sir, Vasquez said. She's in the outer office. Dawson's face did something small and controlled. Hartwell stood. Major Dawson, you're restricted to the installation until further notice, and you will surrender your command access codes to Warrant Officer Skez before you leave this room. You'll be notified when formal proceedings begin. Dawson stood, slowly. He was holding the surface together with visible effort now, the performance dignity beginning to show seams. He looked at Elena for the first time since he'd come into the room. The look was not angry. It was something more precise than anger, the specific look of a man who had made a series of calculations and was only now standing in front of the evidence arranged on the table, understanding where the math had broken. She held his gaze without expression. He looked away first. Patton was 27, a staff sergeant who had been at Blackridge for 2 years and had Dawson's clerk assignment for 14 months. She was small and dark-haired and composed in a way that broke as soon as Vasquez closed the door, and she looked at the row of files on the table and understood what she was looking at. She sat down before anyone told her to. I want to cooperate, she said. Her voice was unsteady. Not performance actual. I want to, whatever I can do to cooperate. I want to do that. Hartwell sat across from her. Tell me about the withdrawal documentation, she told him. It took 11 minutes, and the picture that emerged in those 11 minutes was consistent with what Elena had already constructed, but contained one detail she hadn't had. Dawson had not simply asked Patton to process documentation. He had told her, verbally, on at least 3 occasions, that the Marines whose complaints were being closed had been counseled and had indicated they wished to withdraw, and then provided her with the paperwork to process. He hadn't told her to fabricate signatures. He'd given her paperwork that already had them. Where was the paperwork coming from before it reached you? Hartwell asked. She hesitated. Patton, Elena said from the edge of the room. The young staff sergeant looked at her. You came in here to cooperate, Elena said. That means answering the hard questions, not just the easy ones. A breath. Sergeant Maddox, she said, at least twice. Maybe 3 times. The packages that came to Major Dawson's office, the ones that already had the signatures on them, they came from Maddox. I saw him bring a folder to Dawson, personally. Dawson reviewed it and put it in my stack for processing. The room was quiet. Vasquez's stylus was moving steadily. Did you know the signatures were fabricated? Hartwell asked. A long pause. She was looking at the table. I thought something was wrong, she said finally. I didn't know exactly what, but some of those signatures, I'd seen the complainant's signatures on other documents. They didn't always match. She stopped. I kept processing because Major Dawson kept giving them to me to process. And I didn't. She stopped again. Her voice had gotten unsteady. I didn't think I had the standing to question him. He's a major. I'm a staff sergeant. Hartwell looked at her for a moment. You have standing, he said. Every Marine has standing to refuse an unlawful order. The question of whether you recognize this as unlawful is something we'll work through in the formal process. He stood. You'll be interviewed formally this afternoon. Until then, you are not to discuss the content of this conversation with anyone on this installation. Do you understand? Yes, sir. You can go. She got up and left. The door closed behind her. Hartwell looked at Elena. She was already writing. The morning moved, the way mornings moved when multiple things were happening simultaneously, and none of them were waiting for the others, in parallel, overlapping. Each demanding attention and receiving a portion of it while the large picture assembled itself in pieces. At 940, Ortiz was formally interviewed in the records room. He gave his account with the particular directness of a man who had been waiting to give it for months and had rehearsed it in his head often enough that it came out clean and detailed and in chronological order. He brought the original range documentation. He named the 9 other Marines present on the exercise with Ruiz. He described specifically and without embellishment 2 occasions when he had directly observed Maddox conduct what he characterized as targeted harassment of individual junior Marines under the guise of performance correction. When Hartwell asked him why he hadn't formally escalated beyond the complaint he'd withdrawn, Ortiz was quiet for a moment. I withdrew it, he said, because the Marine I was supporting told me she was afraid that pushing it would get her transferred and she wanted to stay and finish her cycle. He paused. I should have pushed anyway. I've thought about that a lot. Another pause, shorter. I made the wrong call. Hartwell nodded once. Thank you, Gunnery Sergeant. Ortiz stood. At the door, he stopped. The other names, he said. The ones who were transferred. Corvino, Trevino, the others. Will they be contacted? They'll be part of the formal review, Elena said. Ortiz nodded slowly. Then he left. Ruiz came in at 1015. She sat down across from Hartwell, with her hands flat on her thighs, and her face composed in the particular way she'd composed it on the training yard the previous day, when Maddox had stepped on her maintenance cloth, managing the interior through the discipline of external control. Hartwell introduced himself, he explained, briefly and precisely, the scope and purpose of the review, and what formal participation in it meant for her. He explained that her name would be present in the documentation, but that the review process had protections during the investigative phase. He asked her if she had any questions before he began. She thought about it for a moment. Am I going to be here in a month? She asked. Hartwell looked at her. That's the intent, he said. She nodded. Then she started talking. She talked for 22 minutes and didn't stop except when Vasquez asked her to repeat or clarify a date or a name. She described 11 specific incidents over 5 months, not elevated, not dramatized, just reported with the flat documentary precision of someone who had been keeping a mental record because she'd understood instinctively that someday she might need it. Dates, times, witnesses, the exact words Maddox had used on specific occasions. The specific occasions when she'd tried to access the IG process, and what had happened. When she got to the part about the withdrawal form she'd never signed, she stopped for a moment. Someone signed your name on that document, Hartwell said. I know, she said. I found out when the closure notice came back. I went to the records office to see the documentation, and Sergeant Hale showed me the form. She paused. It doesn't look like my signature. It's close, but it doesn't look right. Do you have an example of your signature we can use for comparison? She pulled her military ID and set it on the table. Vasquez documented it. When Ruiz left, she stopped in the doorway and looked at Elena, not the cautious, calibrated look she'd been giving everyone in positions of authority, but something more direct. The look of someone deciding something. Thank you, she said. Elena looked at her. Don't thank me yet, she said. Go run your drills. Something moved across Ruiz's face. Not a smile, something more complicated than that. The expression of a person who had just heard something that sounded like things being addressed rather than postponed. She left. At 1130, Hartwell called for Maddox. Maddox came to the records room with a jaggy officer, a captain named Fisher, young, careful, who looked at the row of files on the table and didn't quite manage to keep the assessment off his face. Maddox sat down across from Hartwell with the residual bearing of someone who had decided to stop performing and was now simply present in his own particular way, which was not small. Fisher put one hand on the table. My client will answer questions on advice of counsel. He's prepared to make a voluntary statement, but I'd like to hear the specific areas of inquiry before. The complaint documentation, Hartwell said. The withdrawal forms. Where they came from before they reached Major Dawson's office. Maddox looked at the table. Fisher leaned close and said something in his ear. Maddox listened. He didn't change position. When Fisher finished, Maddox sat back and looked at Hartwell. I'm going to need to think about what I want to say, he said. That's your right, Hartwell said. The things that happened in the training yard yesterday. He stopped. I'm not going to, I know how that looked. I know I made a mistake there. What I did was wrong, and I'm not going to try to defend it. The room was quiet. Elena, standing at the edge, kept her face still. The other things. He looked at the files. A long pause. Long enough that Fisher started to move, and Maddox made a small motion with one hand that stopped him. I need a few hours to talk to counsel. Then I'll tell you what I know. Hartwell looked at him for a moment. You have until 1,500, he said. At 1,245, Elena was standing outside the administrative building, in the narrow strip of shade along its eastern wall, eating a sandwich she'd gotten from the chow hall and thinking about the text message they know about tonight and what the word tonight could have referred to that she hadn't been aware of planning. She was still thinking about it when Keller appeared around the corner of the building. He was in civilian clothes off duty, technically, though his posture hadn't shifted to match the clothing. He stopped when he saw her, and then he kept walking toward her because he'd clearly made a decision before he turned the corner and was committed to it. Corporal, she said. Ma'am. He stood a foot too far away, the distance of someone who was not sure what category this conversation was going to fall into. I was there yesterday, on the yard. When Sergeant Maddox... I know you were, she said. I wanted on record that I didn't touch you. He said it directly and with some urgency. I moved into position when he ordered me to, but I want it on record that when he actually grabbed your wrist, I hadn't made contact. I hadn't made any contact. She looked at him. That's consistent with what I have observed. He exhaled. Okay. Then he seemed to realize he was still standing there. The text this morning, he said. The 4 words. I don't know who sent it, but I know what it was about. She went very still. Last night, he said, Sergeant Maddox made a call from the NCO office. I was in the adjacent room, and I heard part of it through the wall. I heard him say tonight, and I heard him say the review, and I heard him say he stopped. Swallowed. He said something about the records. About making sure certain things weren't there in the morning. Elena looked at him steadily. Certain things meaning, I don't know specifically. I only heard pieces. But after I heard it, I thought, he stopped again. He was not a particularly articulate man. She could see that. But he was working hard at this. I thought if something happened to those records overnight and I hadn't said anything, that would make me... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The records are secure, she said. They've been in a formally logged access review since this morning. Nothing could have been removed without documentation. He looked at her. You knew already. I didn't know what Maddox said on the call, she said. But I'd flagged the possibility. She paused. Who sent the text? He was quiet. Corporal, she said, not unkindly. You've come this far. Briggs, he said, He was outside the NCO office when Maddox made the call. He sent it from the admin terminal in the hallway. He didn't know your number, so he sent it to the base directory, listing for your quarters. She thought about Briggs, the lance corporal, who'd taken a step back on the training yard, the one whose face had been doing something complicated. Is Briggs here? He's waiting by the motor pool, Keller said. He didn't know if he should come himself. Tell him to come to the records room at 1,000. 400, she said. Tell him it's voluntary, and it matters. Keller nodded. He turned to go. Keller, she said. He stopped. You moved into position when ordered to. Then you stopped. She looked at him. That distinction matters. I want you to know that. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone receiving something they weren't sure they deserved. Then he nodded and walked back around the corner of the building. Elena finished her sandwich and looked at the sky over the eastern tree line. The morning had been long, and it wasn't finished, and the afternoon was going to be longer. But the picture was complete now. All the pieces were in the room. What remained was to make the consequences match the evidence, and to do it in a way that served the Marines whose names were in those folders rather than just the institutional interest in having the numbered slux deck look clean. That part was always harder than the investigation. She walked back inside. At the end of the hallway, she could see, light under the door of Dawson's office still on, still occupied. The light of a man sitting inside the coordinates of the mistake he'd made and working through the arithmetic of what it was going to cost him. She walked past the door without slowing. She had 1,500 to prepare for, and Maddox would not be the only one in that room with things he needed to say before the day was done. The 1,500 meeting didn't start at 1,500. It started at 1,448 because Maddox came early. Elena was in the records room arranging the final documentation sequence when Vasquez opened the door and said quietly that Sergeant Maddox and Captain Fisher were in the hallway, and Maddox had asked if they could begin ahead of schedule. Elena looked at the files on the table, looked at her watch, and said yes. He came in different than he'd been at 1,130. The morning version of Maddox had been holding something together through effort. This version had stopped holding, not collapsed. He was still upright, still in correct uniform, still physically the same man, but something in the organizing tension of him had released, and what remained underneath was more complicated and more human than anything she'd seen from him in the previous 36 hours. Fisher came in behind him and took a position to his left. Hartwell was across the table. Elena stayed at the edge. Maddox sat down and put his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. I want to make a voluntary statement, he said. Fisher put a hand on his arm. I know what I'm doing. He didn't look at his counsel. He looked at Hartwell. I've been talking to Captain Fisher for the last 3 hours, and he's given me good advice, and I'm not going to take all of it. That's my right. Fisher sat back with the expression of a lawyer who had been here before and knew how to manage it. I fabricated 2 of the withdrawal signatures, Maddox said. Corvino and a private named Delgado, whose complaint was closed 11 months ago. Both of them had been reassigned before the paperwork reached Dawson's office. I knew the signatures weren't genuine. I prepared the packages and delivered them to Dawson. The room was quiet. He didn't ask where the withdrawals came from, Maddox said. That's on him, but I knew what I was doing. The other 6 closures, Hartwell said. The ones where the complainants were still on installation, when the withdrawals were processed. Maddox's jaw moved. 3 of those were genuine. The Marines came to me directly and said they wanted to drop it. I believed them. He paused. Maybe I didn't ask hard enough about why they wanted to drop it. But those weren't fabricated. Another pause. The other 3 patent would have to speak to the specific documentation. I delivered packages to Dawson's office. I didn't always produce them myself. Who else was involved in producing them? Fisher leaned in again. Maddox waved him off again. There was another NCO, he said. Staff Sergeant Reyes in the administrative section. He processed some of the internal paperwork when I needed documentation that looked like it had come through the normal channels. I don't know how much he understood about what he was processing. He stopped. He's a good Marine. He's not, don't make him the story here. Hartwell looked at him. That's not your call to make. I know it isn't. He looked at his hands on the table. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I believe, for whatever that's worth right now. Elena watched him. She'd interviewed men in this position before, men who had made choices, and were now sitting inside the full weight of them for the first time without the insulation of institutional authority or the comfortable distance of ongoing operational demand. Some of them in this position became very small. Some of them became combative. Some of them became honest in a way they hadn't been able to be while the system was still running in their favor. Maddox was being honest. She didn't think it was performance. She thought it was the honest response of a man who had been in the Corps long enough and cared about it enough that sitting in front of documented evidence of what he'd done to it was costing him something real. That didn't reduce what he'd done, but it was worth noting accurately. The training conduct, Hartwell said. The pattern of targeted treatment of junior Marines. Maddox looked up. Ruiz, Martinez, Trevino before he transferred. The others named in the complaint documentation. A long pause. Maddox looked at the middle distance. Not quite at Elena, but in her direction. And she had the sense that he was not looking at her specifically, but at the training yard she'd been standing in when she first saw him, the maintenance cloth. Ruiz's hands repositioning components with the flat mechanical compliance of someone who had decided survival required not reacting. I told myself it was standards, he said. I told myself the Corps was going soft and somebody had to hold the line, and if that made me unpopular, that was the cost of the job. He stopped. I told myself that for 6 years. He looked at his hands again. What you saw yesterday, on the yard, that wasn't standards. I know that. I knew it yesterday, and I let it happen anyway. And then I made it worse. He stopped talking. Fisher looked at Hartwell. My client is prepared to cooperate fully with the formal investigative process. He'll provide written statements on all matters discussed today and will make himself available for subsequent interviews. That's noted, Hartwell said. He looked at Maddox. Is there anything else you want to put in the record voluntarily? Maddox looked at Elena directly for the first time since he'd come into the room. What I did on the yard, he said, reaching for you. After you told me not to. He paused. That was wrong. Whatever else is in this room today, that was wrong, and I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway. Another pause, harder. I underestimated you from the moment you walked through my gate. Every decision I made in the last 2 days was based on that underestimation, and I don't have a better explanation for why it happened. She held his gaze. I know you don't, she said. He nodded once. Then he looked back at Hartwell. I'm ready for whatever comes next, he said. By 1630, Dawson had lawyered up completely. The JAG officer who arrived for him was a lieutenant colonel named Brenner, who was older and considerably more calibrated than Fisher, a man who had sat in rooms like this one many times, and who came in looking at the documentation on the table, with the professional assessment of someone taking inventory of the opposing position. He spent 4 minutes reading the key documents. Then he looked at Hartwell. My client will not be making a voluntary statement at this time, he said. That's his right, Hartwell said. My client also wants to formally note, for the record, that the review process under which this documentation was gathered was initiated without proper notification to the installation commander, and that the authorization basis for the reviewing officer has not been fully established to his satisfaction. Hartwell looked at him with the patience of someone who had also been in rooms like this many times. The authorization basis has been documented with command and will be provided to counsel in the formal discovery process. He paused. Is there anything else for the record right now? Brenner looked at the files, the specific look of a lawyer calculating whether any of the available moves would help his client or merely delay the process. "No," he said. "Then Major Dawson's access codes will be collected by Warrant Officer Vasquez before you leave. He's restricted to this installation and should plan to be available for formal proceedings beginning Monday." Dawson, who had been sitting through this with the rigid composure of a man holding himself in a bottle, looked at Hartwell when Monday was mentioned. Something moved across his face, a recalibration of timelines, an understanding that the weekend was not going to be the operational pause he might have hoped for. He didn't say anything. Vasquez collected the access codes. They left. The room was quiet for a moment after the door closed. Elena looked at the table, the 19 files, the range documentation, the photographs, the notes Vasquez had been compiling since 800. The physical weight of 14 months of institutional failure laid out on a folding table in a records room on a training installation most people in the Corps had never heard of. "Patent," Hartwell said. "Cooperation, limited culpability," Elena said. She processed what she was handed without asking the questions she should have asked. She's 27, and she's been in Dawson's orbits since she was 25. "I'd recommend a formal reprimand, reassignment, and no further action unless the formal process surfaces something she hasn't disclosed." Hartwell made a note. "Hale, same architecture. Different timeline, he's been here longer and had more opportunity to notice the pattern. But he came to me voluntarily at 712 with the range documentation, which is the reason we have the cleanest piece of evidence in this room." She paused. "He knew something was wrong. He didn't act on it early enough. I'd argue that's a reprimand and mandatory ethics retraining, not a career-ending action." Reyes. "I want to interview him before I make a recommendation." Maddox characterized him as someone who may not have understood what he was processing. That's either accurate, or it's a man trying to protect someone on his way out the door. "I don't know which yet." Hartwell nodded. He closed his notepad and looked at her. "You've been here 32 hours, he said. "I've been in worse places for longer." "That's not what I'm saying." He looked at the table. The text this morning. Keller's account of Maddox's phone call. "He was trying to reach the records overnight. He couldn't have gotten in," she said. Hale had logged the access review. Any after-hours entry would have required a command override. That would have been documented. He didn't know that. No. She paused. He was working with incomplete information about where things stood, which means he made a move that didn't accomplish anything except putting another data point in the record against him. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. Who was he calling? When he said they know about tonight, who is they? She had been thinking about that since Keller had told her, and she had not arrived at a clean answer, which bothered her in the specific way incomplete conclusions bothered her. "I don't know," she said. "It wasn't Dawson. Dawson was making his own calls through official channels. It could have been someone outside the installation. Someone with a stake in the outcome who Maddox had been in contact with before this review started." She looked at the table. "The formal process will subpoena his call records." "Yes," Hartwell said. "Will." He stood up and started closing folders. Elena helped without being asked, and they worked in the specific silence of two people who had been in enough operational situations together to be comfortable with quiet. "There's going to be a question," Hartwell said, without looking up from the folder he was closing. "From command, about how this was handled." She kept working. "What kind of question?" "The kind that asks whether a senior reviewing officer conducting an investigation at a training installation should have been operating without identified rank for an extended period." He closed another folder. "The kind that notes that a physical confrontation occurred during the review period. I was defending myself. I know that. The documentation supports it, and Keller's account supports it, and Briggs's account will support it." He set the folder on the stack. "I'm not questioning what happened. I'm telling you the question is going to be asked." She straightened up and looked at him. The operational decision to conduct the initial observation phase without identified rank was mine, and I stand by it. If I'd come through that gate with full identification, the behavior I observed on the first morning wouldn't have been visible. Maddox wouldn't have been on the training yard conducting business as usual. Dawson would have been in a formal meeting with me rather than in the operations center at 600 making calls. She paused. I saw what I needed to see because I was nobody. That was the point. Hartwell looked at her for a moment. Write that up, he said, in those words. For the record, I will. He picked up the folder stack. One more thing. He said it the way people said one more thing when the thing was actually the point of the conversation. General Mahan wants to speak with you tomorrow morning. 800 video conference. General Mahan was 2 stars. She'd met him twice and formed a clear opinion both times, the second of which had involved a disagreement about operational methodology that had been significant enough to generate paperwork. About this review? She asked. About this review, he said, and about the proposal that's been sitting on his desk for 6 weeks. She was quiet. He wants to talk about the oversight division, Hartwell said. The structure, the scope, the staffing. He had questions about the framework 6 weeks ago, and he's been sitting on them. I think what happened here this week answered some of them. Or raised new ones. Possibly both. He moved toward the door. I'll have Vasquez set up the connection in the operations center at 7:45 so you have time to settle in before he comes on. He stopped with his hand on the door. Get some sleep tonight. More than 2 hours. He left. Elena stood in the empty records room for a moment, looking at the cleared table. The files were stacked and would be transported under secure handling tomorrow. The photographs were in the formal evidence chain. Vasquez's documentation was encrypted and uploaded to command servers, which meant the physical copies here were now secondary, backed up, safe from anything Maddox or anyone else might have tried to do to them overnight. The room smelled like old paper and the specific climate-controlled neutrality of spaces that handled sensitive documents. She'd been in hundreds of rooms like it. She turned off the light and walked out. The evening formation was at 1,800, and Hartwell addressed it. Esina stood at the same lateral position he'd taken that morning and watched the same 340 faces processing a different quality of information. In the morning, they'd been receiving news of a review. Now they were receiving the preliminary results of one, stated in the careful institutional language that was designed to convey seriousness without prejudicing formal proceedings. Hartwell told them that 2 senior personnel had been placed on administrative restriction, pending formal investigation. He told them that the complaint documentation process at Blackridge was under formal review and that all previously closed complaints from the past 18 months would be re-examined. He told them that a process would be established for Marines to come forward with information relevant to the review, and that participation would not result in retaliation, and that a retaliation protection protocol was now active on this installation. He told them that Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Ortiz would serve as the interim senior NCO for training operations effective immediately. At the mention of Ortiz's name, something moved through the formation that Elena had seen before and never quite got used to seeing: a subtle, collective exhale, the specific sound of several hundred people simultaneously releasing tension they'd been carrying long enough to forget they were carrying it. Not a cheer, not a reaction, just a breath. The breath of people who had been waiting for a particular answer and had finally received it. Ortiz was standing in his position in the formation, and he kept his face forward and correct. But his jaw had shifted slightly, the specific shift of a man absorbing something significant while maintaining bearing. Ruiz was 3 rows back, and Elena couldn't see her face from this angle. But she could see the line of her shoulders, and it was different than it had been at 630 in the chow hall. After the formation broke, she found Ortiz near the equipment bay, conducting a walkthrough of the day's end checks. He looked up when she approached and finished the notation he was making before he turned toward her. "Gunnery, Sergeant," she said. "Ma'am." He held the clipboard in front of him with both hands. "Interim Senior NCO. How does that feel?" He thought about it for a moment in the particular way he thought about things visibly, working through it, not performing consideration, but actually doing it. "Heavy," he said. "It feels heavy." "Good," she said. "Heavy means you understand it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the equipment bay. "What happens to Maddox?" "Not the formal process." "I know the formal process. What actually happens?" She considered the question. He made a voluntary statement and offered full cooperation. That matters in the formal outcome. He won't be a sergeant again. Whether he stays in the Corps in any capacity is a decision above both our pay grades right now. She paused. He did real damage. He also, at the end, didn't try to hide from it. Both of those things are true. Ortiz absorbed this. "He wasn't always that way," he said. "When I first got here, 6 years ago, he was a hard NCO, but he was a fair one. Somewhere in those 6 years, something went sideways." He paused. "I don't know when. I've thought about it a lot. I don't know when it happened." "It usually doesn't have a specific moment," she said. "It usually happens in the space between small decisions that each seem defensible." Ortiz looked at her. "Is that what you write in the reports? Or is that what you actually think?" "Both," she said. He nodded slowly. "Corvino," he said. "And Trevino and the others. Will they actually come back into the process? Or is that Command will make contact with every Marine whose complaint was closed without proper investigation. The formal review will include them whether or not they're still on this installation." She paused. "Corvino is the clearest case. The documentation on his withdrawal is unambiguous. Whatever he wants to do with that, the process will support it." Ortiz looked at the clipboard in his hands. Then he looked at the training yard. In the evening light, with the formations gone and the drills finished, it was just a tarmac with equipment racks and a maintenance area and the marks of 1,000 boots and 1,000 exercises, entirely ordinary. "When Maddox grabbed your wrist," he said. He stopped. She waited. "I should have been there earlier. The first time he came at you, I was on the far side of the yard. I heard it before I saw it. By the time I got there, he stopped again. I've been telling myself that it happened fast, and the distance was real, and that's all true. But I've also been telling myself things were fine here for 6 years, and I've had to reckon with how much that was selective attention." He looked at her. "I'm not trying to make this about me." "I know you're not," she said. "I just wanted to say that I should have been faster. And I know what it looks like that I wasn't." She looked at him for a moment, this man who had spent 4 years doing the right thing inside a system that was rewarding the wrong things, who had filed complaints and withdrawn them, and filed them again, and stayed when he could have left, and was now standing in an equipment bay at 1,830, holding himself accountable for a gap of 30 seconds on a training yard. "You de-escalated a situation that was heading toward something worse," she said. "You provided documentation that was critical to this review. You sent 2 Marines to me with information I needed." She paused. "The accounting doesn't look the way you think it does." He was quiet. "Do your job, Gunnery Sergeant," she said. "Starting tomorrow." She left him with the equipment checks and walked back toward the administrative building. At 1,915, she sat down at the desk in her temporary quarters and opened her laptop and began writing the preliminary report. This was the part nobody saw, the part that came after the visible resolution, after the formation and the formal statements and the confrontation in the records room. The part that was 2 hours of translating everything that had happened into language that was precise enough to survive legal scrutiny and complete enough to inform the people making decisions about what came next. She was not a natural writer in the conventional sense. She wrote the way she investigated directly, without ornamentation, more interested in accuracy than elegance. Her reports had been described over the years as efficient, which she took as a compliment. What she cared about was that the people reading them understood exactly what had happened and why, and that the Marines whose names appeared in the documentation were represented as specifically and accurately as they had described themselves in the interviews. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping, except to check dates and cross-reference timestamps. At 2115, she reached the section on Maddox's voluntary statement, and she paused. This was the part of the report that was going to require the most care, because it involved a human complexity that institutional language was not well designed to hold. A man who had built something real and then systematically corroded it, who had, at the end, been honest in a way that was going to cost him the career he'd spent 22 years building, who had grabbed a superior officer's wrist and put himself on the ground, and then 36 hours later, sat across his house and said, "I knew it was wrong when I did it," without flinching from what that meant. She wasn't writing a character study. She was writing a report. The report would note what he'd done and what he'd said and what the documentation showed, and the formal process would determine the consequences, and none of that was in her hands. But she wrote the voluntary statement section with the particular care she gave to sections that were going to matter to the people reading them. Not softened, not dramatized, just accurate. She finished at 2241 and read it back through once. Then she sent the encrypted draft to Vasquez for initial formatting and closed the laptop. She sat in the chair for a moment with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been operating at full attention for 36 hours and was now in the first quiet moment she'd had since walking through the eastern gate. Her phone was on the desk. She picked it up and looked at the forward text again. They know about tonight. Briggs had sent it from a hallway terminal because he was 23 years old and had heard something through a wall that frightened him and hadn't known what else to do. She was going to recommend in her supplemental notes that Briggs receive a formal commendation for the disclosure, framed Prägend Fickler around the institutional value of speaking up, rather than the specific circumstances that had made it necessary. She thought about Ruiz in the chow hall that morning. It doesn't matter. The flat resignation of it, the very specific way hope died in people who had tried to use institutional processes that hadn't functioned. She thought about Corvino's transfer order, dated 6 days before the withdrawal notation. The bureaucratic neatness of it. Whoever had created that document had been doing something so routine. They'd stopped being careful enough to get the dates right. At 2300, she turned off the light and lay down. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She was up at 545 an hour, before the Operations Center video conference setup was scheduled. She showered, dressed, made coffee with the in-room setup, and sat with it at the desk, reviewing the sections of the report she'd flagged for revision. There were 3 of them. She worked through them methodically, not rushing, making the language more precise in 2 places and walking back a conclusion in the third where the evidence supported inference but not certainty, and certainty was the only thing that belonged in a formal preliminary report. At 700, she walked to the chow hall. It was a different morning than yesterday's. The base felt different, not transformed, not resolved, but altered in some specific way that she could feel in the quality of the ambient noise and the way people moved in the common spaces. Less tight, less careful. The Marines eating breakfast talked at normal volume, which sounds unremarkable until you've spent 36 hours in a space where conversations had been conducted 2 registers below normal because people had learned to be careful about ears. She got coffee and a plate and sat at a corner table. Ruiz came in at 720 and went through the line, and this time she looked up when she came out, scanned the room. And when she saw Elena, she came directly over rather than retreating to the back wall. She sat down across the table. "I heard about Gunnery Sergeant Ortiz," she said. Word moves fast, on a small base. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Is it real or is it temporary?" and then it goes back to how it was. Elena looked at her. Ortiz is interim. The permanent assignment will go through the standard command process. But the recommendation will reflect the review findings, and the review findings are in the record. She paused. It's not going back to how it was. Ruiz looked at the table. She was quiet for a moment, in a way that wasn't unhappy, more processing, recalibrating something she'd been carrying in a specific way for a long time, and was now adjusting for new weight distribution. The complaint review, she said. The re-examination of the closed ones. Is that it's happening? Elena said. Your file will be formally reopened. The documentation supports the case. The outcome of the formal process isn't something I control, but the investigation will be complete and the evidence is in the chain. Ruiz nodded slowly. I know that's not a guaranteed outcome, Elena said. I'm not promising you a specific result. I'm telling you the process will be what the process was supposed to be when you filed 8 weeks ago. That's more than I had yesterday, Ruiz said. They sat for a moment in the specific quiet of two people who had said the necessary things and didn't need to add to them. Then Ruiz said, Can I ask you something personal? Elena looked at her. When you walked through the gate, day before yesterday, with no rank and no explanation, she paused. Was that because you didn't trust what you'd find? If they knew who you were? Yes, Elena said. And you were right, I was. Ruiz looked at her coffee cup. I've thought about that a lot since yesterday. About how much you'd have missed if you'd been visible from the start. She paused. The way Maddox treated me on the yard, he did that because I was someone he thought couldn't do anything about it. She paused again. He did the same thing to you for the same reason. And he was wrong about both of us. Elena looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said, he was. Ruiz finished her coffee. She picked up her tray and stood, and there was something in how she stood that was different from how she'd stood at the back wall the previous morning. A small adjustment in the shoulders, a fractional difference in how much space she was taking up. Not performance, just a person who was slightly less compressed than she'd been. I have a drill at 800, she said. Go, Elena said. She went. Elena sat with the rest of her coffee and thought about the 800 video conference General Mahan, 2 stars, the proposal that had been sitting on his desk for 6 weeks, the questions he'd been sitting with. She thought about Hartwell's word, heavy. She thought about what it would mean to run a division designed to find the Blackridges before they became what Blackridge had become. To build a structure that could walk through a gate with no rank and no explanation and find the things that were being hidden by the people whose job it was not to hide them. She thought about the 18-month window at Blackridge, the 19 complaints, the 8 closures, the Marines who'd been transferred out and the ones who'd stayed and suffered the staying. The paperwork that had been so careful and so routine that it had almost worked. Almost. She finished her coffee and picked up her tray. At the door of the chow hall, she stopped. Across the main parade ground, the morning training cycle was beginning. She could see the fire teams assembling, the NCOs moving into position, the daily machinery of a military installation starting its first rotation of the day. It looked the same as any other morning on any other base. But the sergeant running the first drill near the Eastern Equipment Bay was not Maddox. She didn't know the corporal's name yet. He was young, and from this distance, she could see him giving instructions, not yelling, just talking, the kind of talking that expected to be listened to without needing volume to enforce it. The 4 Marines in front of him were listening. She watched for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the operations center for the 800 conference. The proposal on Mahan's desk was 47 pages. She'd written it over 3 months, revised it twice, and argued about the staffing projections with a lieutenant colonel in the planning division, who had strong opinions about budget allocation and limited patience for operational nuance. The core of it was simple, stated on page 1, in the plain language she used when plain language was what mattered. The most effective oversight is invisible until it is necessary. and becomes most necessary precisely in the environments least likely to welcome it. She'd written that sentence 11 months ago, before Blackridge had appeared in her working file as a 4-line flag, Zikonlan from an IG intake coordinator, who thought something was off but couldn't point to exactly what. 4 lines had become 19 files, had become a records room on a hot Wednesday morning, and a man who had underestimated her from the gate and discovered in 36 hours exactly what that had cost him. She pushed open the door to the operations center. Vasquez was already at the setup station, the encrypted video link open and cycling through its authentication sequence. The screen was dark, the connection pending. Somewhere on the other end of it, a 2-star general was looking at a 47-page proposal and deciding what questions he still had. She sat down in the chair in front of the screen, pulled out her notepad, uncapped her pen. The screen came to life. General Mahan came on screen at exactly 800, which told her something about him. She already knew he was the kind of man who was ready when he said he'd be ready, not 30 seconds before as a performance and not 30 seconds after as a power move, but on the precise second of the stated time because precision was simply how he operated. He was 61, gray-haired, with the particular face of a man who had spent 4 decades making difficult decisions and had developed the specific feature of senior military leadership that Elena had always found useful to read, the ability to be completely unreadable when he chose and completely readable when he chose, and to switch between the two with no visible transition. He was reading her when the connection established. "Colonel Voss," he said. "General Mahon, I've read Hartwell's preliminary summary." He had a single sheet of paper in front of him that he wasn't looking at. "You want to add anything before I ask questions?" "No, sir. The physical confrontation on the training yard. I was defending myself from an unlawful contact attempt by a non-commissioned officer who had been advised twice that I was authorized to be in that area and who I had given a direct verbal warning to immediately prior to the contact. The technique you used, appropriate minimum force for the specific contact attempt." His arm was not injured. He was not injured. Mahan looked at her. "I'm not questioning whether it was justified. I'm establishing the record." He paused. "The review methodology, operating without identified rank for the initial observation period. The methodology produced evidence that would not have been visible under a standard identified inspection protocol," she said. "The specific conduct I observed on the first morning, Maddox's treatment of Ruiz, the ambient climate of the installation, those were behaviors that would have been modified or suspended in the presence of a visibly identified senior officer. The value of the observation period was its invisibility. And the risk was that a Marine put his hands on a senior officer without knowing she was one. The risk was that I might have to defend myself, which I did, and that the incident would be documented and have consequences, which it has." She paused. "The alternative was a standard inspection that produced clean numbers on a base where the numbers had been deliberately kept clean, regardless of what was actually happening." Mahan was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of disagreement, the quiet of someone absorbing an argument they'd already half-made themselves. "The proposal," he said. She waited. "I've had 6 questions about it for 6 weeks." He picked up the sheet of paper. "I'm going to ask them, and I want direct answers." "Yes, sir." "Staffing. You've projected a division of 12. My planning office says the work you're describing requires 22 minimum. Your planning office is correct if the division operates on a standard inspection model," she said. "The methodology I'm proposing requires fewer personnel because the observation phase is conducted by 1 or 2 officers. Maximum more people means more visibility, which defeats the purpose. The 12 covers the investigation phase, the documentation capacity, and the formal proceedings support. The 22 model is for a different kind of oversight than what I'm proposing." A pause. He made a note. "Jurisdiction conflicts," he said. "Installation commanders will push back. They have command authority on their installations and A division that can walk through their gates unidentified is going to be read as a threat to that authority. Yes, she said. It will. He looked at her. That's your answer? It will be perceived as a threat, she said. The installations that have something to hide will experience it as a threat and infelt and will push back through every available channel. The installations that are functioning correctly will experience it as a nuisance once every 18 months that produces a clean report and then goes away. She paused. The question is whether the institutional value of finding the Blackridges before they run for 14 months outweighs the political cost of commanding officers who feel surveilled. And your answer to that question? I wouldn't have written 47 pages if I thought the cost outweighed the value, sir. Mahan looked at her for a long moment. His face was in the readable mode. She could see the assessment happening behind it, the specific calculation of a man who had been trying to find the hole in an argument for 6 weeks and was now sitting across a video link from the person who'd made it, who had just spent 36 hours demonstrating it in practice. The physical safety of operating officers, he said. You were alone in a situation that escalated to physical confrontation. The next officer who runs this methodology might not have your training background. She had been waiting for this question. Section 4 of the proposal, she said. Pages 31 through 34. Selection criteria for division personnel require a minimum of 2 years in a combat-adjacent MOS, Advanced CQB, certification and completion of the Federal Investigator Training Program. I'm not proposing to send administrative officers into environments like Blackridge. I'm proposing to build a division of people who are trained for exactly the conditions those environments create. He was quiet again. You wrote that section after you'd already been assigned this review, he said. Before you went to Blackridge. Yes, sir. So you anticipated the possibility of physical escalation. I anticipated that environments where complaints are being systematically suppressed are environments where institutional authority has been misused, and that people who have been misusing institutional authority don't always respond reasonably when that authority is challenged. She paused. I prepared accordingly. Mahan sat back slightly. The unreadable mode again, but she'd learned to distinguish its varieties. This one wasn't opposition. It was something closer to a decision being finalized. I have one more question, he said. Sir, why do you want to run it? You could write the framework, hand it off, and go back to field assessment. That's what you're good at. Most people in your position would hand it off. The question sat in the air between them, across however many hundreds of miles of encrypted video link. She thought about Ruiz's shoulders at the back wall of the chow hall, compressed inward, taking up less space than she was entitled to. She thought about Corvino's transfer order and the withdrawal notation 6 days later, the bureaucratic casualness of it, the routine efficiency of a system that had been running long enough that the people inside it had stopped noticing what it was doing. She thought about Ortiz saying, I've been here 4 years, and I've filed 2 complaints that went nowhere in looking at the wall while he said it. Because I've spent 6 years doing field assessment, and I know how to find these situations, she said. But finding them isn't the same as preventing them. The proposal isn't just an investigation framework, it's a deterrence model. If installations know that a review can happen at any time through any door by anyone who might or might not be identified, the math changes for the people considering whether to bury a complaint or let a Maddox run for 6 years. She paused. I want to build the thing that changes the math. That's not a job I'm willing to hand off. Mahan looked at her. All right, he said. 2 words. She'd learned not to underestimate 2-word answers from general officers. You'll have a formal response from my office by end of week, he said. Expect it to be positive and expect it to have conditions. I expected both, sir. I'm sure you did. He picked up the sheet of paper. Blackridge. The formal proceedings, what's your timeline estimate? Dawson is the complex case. His counsel will slow the process. I estimate 6 to 8 weeks for the formal charges and 60 to 90 days for the full proceedings. She paused. Maddox's voluntary cooperation will accelerate his case. I'd estimate 30 to 45 days. And the junior Marines. The re-examination of the closed complaints will begin next week. Command is coordinating contact with the transferred Marines now. Corvino's case is the strongest and will likely resolve first. She paused. Ruiz's complaint will be fully investigated, and I expect it to be substantiated. Mahan nodded once. Good work, Colonel, he said. It was not effusive. It was the precise weight of 2 words from a man who used words at their exact value. Thank you, sir. The screen went dark. She sat in the operations center for a few minutes after the connection closed, looking at the dark screen and the reflected shape of herself in it, the plain utility uniform, the notepad, the pen she was still holding. The version of herself that had walked through the Eastern Gate 2 mornings ago, anonymous and deliberate, carrying everything she needed in a canvas bag and a notepad and the trained patience to wait for the right moment. Vasquez appeared in the doorway. The transport is scheduled for 1,400, she said. If you want to be on it, I want to be on it, Elena said. She had 3 hours. She spent the first hour finishing the supplemental notes on Briggs and Keller, the commendation recommendation for Briggs, the formal notation of Keller's restraint on the training yard. She wanted those in the record before she left the installation, while the specifics were exact, and while they still had the weight of immediacy rather than the flattened quality of details recalled later from memory. She spent the second hour walking, not with a destination, not with a notepad. She left the administrative building and crossed the main parade ground and moved through the installation at the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere to be for 60 minutes and was choosing to use them this way. The training bays were active. Morning drills in 3 of the 4 operational areas, NCOs running their sections through the day's curriculum. She moved through the periphery the way she'd moved through it on that first morning, quietly, without purpose that announced itself, background noise in a utility uniform. But the installation felt different than it had on that first morning. Not cleaned up. Cleaned up was the wrong word for it. Too quick, too total. More like a room where someone had stopped pretending the furniture arrangement was fine and actually started moving things. Incomplete and in progress and awkward in places, but honest in a way the previous arrangement hadn't been. She passed the eastern bay where Maddox had circled Ruiz with her radio components. A corporal she didn't recognize was running a drill there now, 3 privates working a communications setup under time constraints, the corporal counting down with the flat efficiency of someone focused on the task rather than the person doing it. She stopped and watched for 30 seconds. The 3 privates were talking to each other while they worked low-voiced, tasks-specific. The specific collaboration of people who were allowed to help each other rather than perform individually for an evaluator who was looking for failure. Small thing. Not small thing. She kept walking. At the far edge of the installation, near the eastern perimeter fence, she stopped and looked out at the tree line where the helicopter had broken cover 2 mornings ago, the moment the whole geometry of Blackridge had shifted. The sound of it, the rotor rhythm, the priority approach angle, had reached Maddox before it reached her, and she'd watched the math change in his face from 15 meters away. She thought about what Mahan had said. Why do you want to run it? The honest answer was longer than what she'd given him. And she'd given him the true part of it. She'd just given him the institutional true part. The part that belonged in a video conference with a 2-star general who needed to know the operational reasoning. The other part was simpler and harder to put in institutional language. She thought about being 26 and new to field assessment and walking into a situation that looked like Blackridge, smaller scale, earlier stage, and not understanding for the first 3 days what she was actually looking at. Thinking it was a personnel problem, a management failure, something that could be addressed with the right recommendations and the right reassignments. And then on the 4th day, understanding that it was a system deliberate, self-reinforcing, protected by the institutional authority of the people who were supposed to be preventing exactly what they were perpetuating. And understanding that she was the only person in a position to do anything about it. She hadn't been a colonel then, she'd been a captain. She'd been a captain with 6 months of field assessment experience and no formal methodology for what she was looking at. And she'd stayed 2 weeks past her scheduled assessment window and filed a report that her supervising officer had described as comprehensive and unprecedented for someone at her grade level. The Marines whose names were in that report had received full investigations. 3 of them were still in the Corps. She'd tracked it quietly over the years. She'd always tracked it. That was the part that didn't fit in a proposal or a video conference. The part that was just she kept track of the names, of what happened to them. Not as a file or a database, just in the way certain things stayed in a person, rather than fading the way most operational details faded. Corvino would be one of those names, and Ruiz, and the others. She turned away from the tree line and walked back toward the administrative building. At 1315, she was in the temporary quarters with her bag packed and her notepad in the outer pocket when someone knocked on the door. She opened it. Ruiz was standing in the hallway in her PT uniform, slightly out of breath, like she'd come from wherever she'd been in a hurry and was only now assembling a less hurried exterior. "I heard you were leaving at 1400, she said. "I am." Ruiz stood there for a moment. She had something in her hand, a folded piece of paper. She held it out. Elena took it and opened it. It was a handwritten list of 6 names, each with a brief notation: dates, circumstances, what had happened. The Marines who'd been transferred or separated from Blackridge over the past 14 months. Ruiz had known all of them. "I wrote down what I remember about each one," Ruiz said. "I know the formal process will contact them, but those are things I know that might not be in any file." She paused. "I thought it might help." Elena looked at the list. The handwriting was careful and compact. The notations, specific dates, times, specific incidents Ruiz had witnessed or been told about directly. It was in its handwritten way exactly the kind of supplemental witness record that could make the difference in a formal investigation between a clear picture and an incomplete one. "This will help," Elena said. Ruiz nodded. She started to turn. "Private Ruiz." She stopped. Elena looked at her, the young Marine, who had been kneeling beside a disassembled radio on a maintenance cloth on a Wednesday morning, repositioning components that someone had knocked out of alignment, working with the flat mechanical compliance of someone who had decided survival required not reacting, who had been doing that for months, who had come to the chow hall the next morning and sat across a table and said it doesn't matter, and then 24 hours later stood at the door of a records room and said thank you, and been told to go run her drills. "The complaint process is going to take time," Elena said. "The formal proceedings are going to take longer than you want them, too. There are going to be days when it feels like nothing is happening." She paused. "Keep showing up. Keep your record clean. Keep doing the job." Another pause. "The process works if you stay in it long enough to let it." Ruiz looked at her. "You stayed," she said. "You could have left. You could have put in for reassignment a 3rd time, and eventually it would have gone through. But you stayed." "I stayed because leaving felt like—" She stopped. "I don't know. Like they won." Elena nodded slowly. "That's a good reason," she said. "Hold on to it." Ruiz looked at her for one more moment. Then she straightened slightly, not a salute, just a small adjustment, the kind of adjustment that meant something between 2 people who both understood what it meant. She left. Elena folded the list carefully and put it in her notepad. She was at the helipad at 1350. Hartwell was already there with Vasquez and 2 other administrative personnel from the formal review team. The transport was in approach, a different aircraft than the command. Helicopter from 2 mornings ago, standard installation transport. Nothing priority about it. Ortiz was there. She hadn't expected him. He was in full uniform, squared away, standing at the edge of the helipad with the particular formality of a senior NCO who had decided something was worth showing up for and was showing up for it correctly. She walked over. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him. He looked like himself, 4 years of frustration. He looked like himself, 4 years of frustration that had been replaced with something heavier and more responsible, which was in its own way harder to carry. He knew that. She could see that he knew it. "The interim assignment," she said. "It won't be interim for long. You don't know that." "I have a reasonable projection," she said. He almost smiled at that. "Almost. You've got a functional section and a training cycle to finish, and about 60 Marines who slept better last night than they did the night before. Start there." "Yes, ma'am." The transport was on final approach, the rotor noise building. Vasquez was moving equipment toward the landing pad. "Ruiz is going to be fine," Ortiz said. He said it with the specific conviction of a man who had been watching that particular Marine for months and had formed a clear opinion. "I know," Elena said. "Good Marines get broken in places like this," he said. "I wanted to make sure someone outside this installation knew that she wasn't broken. She was under a lot of pressure for a long time, and she didn't break." Elena looked at him. "I know that too," she said. "It's in the report." He absorbed that. The transport touched down, and the rotor wash hit them both, and they turned their faces slightly against it. She picked up her bag. "Take care of your Marines, Gunnery Sergeant," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She walked toward the transport. She sat by the window on the port side, which gave her a view of the installation as they lifted off the parade ground, the training bays, the administrative building, the eastern perimeter, where she'd stood looking at the tree line 40 minutes ago. It looked small from the air. Most things did. The physical scale of a place that had held several hundred people and 14 months of institutional failure, and a complicated, human, ongoing mess of decisions and consequences it reduced to a rectangle of tarmac and roof lines bordered by Virginia tree line. And then the tree line closed over it, and it was gone. She looked away from the window. In her bag, folded inside the notepad, Ruiz's list of 6 names. In the encrypted drive, Vasquez was carrying 19 folders, the range documentation, the photographs, patent statement, Maddox's voluntary disclosure, the preliminary report she'd finished at 2,241 the night before. In the formal channel, pending a response from Mahan's office that would be positive and would have conditions. In the processing queue at the Corps' legal office, the Dawson case, which would be slow and complicated, and would involve a lieutenant colonel named Brenner making every available argument. And in the actual world, presently running, Ortiz on the training ground, Ruiz at her drill. Briggs, who would get a commendation he didn't know was coming. Keller, who had stopped at the right moment and would carry that stopping with him in the specific way people carried the decisions they'd almost gotten wrong. Hale, who had processed what he was handed and then walked to her door at 712 with a photocopy. Patton, who had known something was wrong and had kept going and was now at the beginning of a very different chapter. Corvino, somewhere off installation, who was about to receive a call from a command review officer telling him that his complaint had been reopened. The transport leveled off at altitude. Hartwell was across the aisle, with his folder open, making notes. Vasquez was logging documentation on her tablet. The crew chief was doing the routine checks that crew chiefs did at altitude. Elena opened her notepad to a clean page. She thought about what Mahan's conditions would be and began working through them preemptively, the staffing number he'd probably push back on, the jurisdictional protocol he'd want more specifically defined, the physical safety requirements she'd already built into Section 4, but would need to strengthen with additional language to satisfy whoever reviewed it from the legal side. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she stopped, the transport was descending toward its destination, and she looked at the clean page that was now not clean, filled with the foundation of what would become the next draft of the proposal, better in 3 places, more specific in 2, and now carrying 47 hours of direct operational experience in its margins. She capped the pen. She thought about the eastern gate of Blackridge. On a Wednesday morning, the coffee and resentment smell of the guard post. The young lance corporal, with the scar above his eyebrow, looking at her credentials and arriving at the same absence of obvious rank that everyone who looked at her that day had arrived at. Nobody important. Background noise. The woman nobody recognized. She had walked through that gate as all of those things simultaneously, and the distance between what she appeared to be and what she actually was had been precisely the distance required to see what needed to be seen. She didn't romanticize it. The distance had cost something it always did. 36 hours of operating in a hostile environment without backup, a physical confrontation she'd managed correctly, but that could have gone differently. The specific exhaustion of maintaining a false surface across 2 full days of pressure and observation. The cost and value weren't the same thing, and the value was 19 files in an encrypted drive and 60 Marines who would sleep better this week than they had last week, and a process that was now moving instead of standing still. The transport touched down. She closed the notepad, picked up her bag, and walked off the aircraft into the afternoon. She had a proposal to finish. She had a division to build. She had names to keep track of. 3 weeks later, the formal charges against Major James Dawson were filed. He was removed from command authority the same afternoon. The proceedings would take months. Brenner made sure of that, but the outcome, when it came, was the outcome the evidence had always pointed toward. Cole Maddox was separated from the Marine Corps 41 days after his voluntary statement. The process was not clean or quick or without its complicated moments, because nothing involving 22 years of service ever was. He signed the paperwork on a Tuesday morning with Fisher present and walked out of a legal office in a civilian shirt, and whatever happened next was no longer something Elena tracked. The 6 complaint cases that had been administratively closed were formally reopened. 5 of them were substantiated. Corvino, reached by phone on a Thursday afternoon, said very little when the review officer explained what had happened, and then said he needed a few minutes, and the review officer heard him set the phone down and not come back for 4 minutes. And when he came back, his voice was steady, and he said he'd like to participate in the formal process. Ruiz's case was substantiated in full. The findings were delivered to her by Ortiz, not because that was the standard process, but because Elena had made a quiet recommendation, and Hartwell had acted on it. Ortiz came to the training bay where Ruiz was running a communications drill and told her outside in the short, flat language of someone who had been waiting to deliver a specific piece of information for several months. And Ruiz listened with her arms at her sides and her face forward, and when he finished, she nodded once and said, "Thank you, gunnery, Sergeant," and went back to her drill. She didn't break until she was in the barracks that evening, and that was where she should have broken, and it was hers. The Oversight Division was 6 weeks after the Blackridge Review closed. The conditions Mahan attached were 4, a revised staffing protocol that Elena accepted, a jurisdictional notification requirement that she negotiated down from the original draft, a physical safety standard for division personnel that matched what she'd written in Section 4, and a quarterly reporting requirement that she'd actually wanted from the beginning and had strategically omitted from the proposal, knowing it would be added. She signed the establishment documents on a Friday afternoon in an office. The Imstoons in an office didn't have enough chairs and had a window that faced a parking structure. She didn't care about the window. The first seminar she ran for new division personnel was 6 weeks after that, in a conference room with bad coffee and good light. 12 officers who had been selected through the criteria she'd written and who arrived already knowing the Blackridge report because she'd made it required reading. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them 12 people who were going to walk through the way she'd walked through Blackridge's gate as nobody important, carrying notepads and the trained patients to wait for what needed to be seen. She said, it's like one thing before they started. The installations that need you most are the ones that will work hardest to convince you there's nothing to find. That's not a warning. That's a methodology. She picked up her pen. They got to work. Because real authority doesn't announce itself at the gate. It's the thing that's standing when everything built on fear has finally fallen down.